thank you for choosing to spend a little time here with me tonight. It always means more than I can quietly express, knowing you return to these gentle stories and peaceful journeys. If you feel like supporting the channel, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe. It's never an obligation, and yet it helps in ways that ripple far further than you might imagine, allowing me to keep creating these calm spaces for you to drift into. So settle in. Let the day loosen its grip. Allow your breath to soften, your thoughts to unspool, and your body to rest. Unhurried and unburdened, letting the world grow a little quieter as the story begins. The Blood Clot Prophecy. It is worth mentioning before we begin that all of the story you are about to hear was very nearly lost to history. In 1866, a Russian monk working in the archives of China uncovered a remarkable manuscript. It was a Chinese copy of a lost Mongolian document, written by an unknown author sometime in the 13th century. This book used Chinese characters to recreate the phonetic sounds of the Mongolian language, and was used as a kind of textbook to help Chinese scholars who were learning Mongolian. For this reason, its characters appeared to be nonsense in Chinese, and so it was lost among the archives for centuries. But once its contents were deciphered, it transformed our understanding of this period. It was a document written only for the eyes of the Mongolian royal family, telling in unprecedented detail the ups and downs of their story. For this reason, it came to be known as the secret history of the Mongols. It is the first and most important source ever written in the Mongolian language, and it blends narrative history with flourishes of vaulting epic poetry. In the year 1162, somewhere on the windswept steppes of Mongolia, a child was born clutching a blood clot in his fist. According to Mongol shamans, this was an omen of a destiny soaked in greatness and in blood, a sign that this boy was destined to become a great warrior. From that moment, on the vast and unforgiving steppes, a legend began to take shape. An orphan, a slave, a survivor, who would rise to command the greatest land empire the world has ever seen. His name was Temüjin. The world would come to know him by another name, Genghis Khan. But who was the real Genghis Khan? A brutal conqueror? A visionary leader? Or something far more complex? Tonight we journey into his world, a world of shifting tribes, impossible odds, and a force of will powerful enough to reshape history itself. By the time of his death, in 1227, this man, born into obscurity, orphaned as a child, enslaved and hunted, had forged the largest contiguous land empire in human history. An empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the shores of Eastern Europe. An empire that encompassed more than 22% of the world's land area and ruled over more than 100 million people. But Genghis Khan was more than just a conqueror. He was a revolutionary who transformed warfare, governance, and international trade. He established religious tolerance in an age of fanaticism. He created the first international postal system. He promoted individuals based on merit rather than birthright. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road flourished as never before, connecting East and West in an unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Yet his legacy is also written in blood. Entire cities were razed to the ground. Millions perished in his campaign. His name became synonymous with terror, and for centuries he was portrayed in the West as the ultimate barbarian, a scourge sent to punish civilized humanity. Who was the real Genghis Khan? How did a boy from a minor clan, cast out and left to die, rise to become the most powerful man on earth? What drove him? What were his methods? And what does his extraordinary life tell us about leadership, resilience, and the forces that shape history? This is the story of Temüjin of the Borjigin clan, the man who would become Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. It is a story of survival against impossible odds, of strategic brilliance and ruthless pragmatism, of empire building on a scale never seen before or since. It is a story that changed the world forever. Welcome to the steppes of 13th century Mongolia. Our journey begins in one of the harshest environments on Earth, a place where only the strong survive, where tribal warfare is a way of life, and where a young boy named Temüjin is about to be tested in ways that will forge him into a legend. Chapter 1. The World of the Steppes and the Story of Alun. To understand Genghis Khan, we must first understand the world into which he was born. The Mongolian plateau in the 12th century was a brutal, unforgiving landscape. Imagine endless grasslands stretching to the horizon, bitterly cold winters, where temperatures could plunge to 40 degrees below zero, and scorching summers with little water. This was a land of nomadic peoples, herders who followed their livestock across vast distances, living in portable felt tents called gurs or yurts. The Mongols were not a unified people. They were divided into numerous tribes and clans, constantly feuding over pasture lands, horses, and honor. The Tatars, Merkits, Karaits, Naimans, and dozens of other groups competed for survival and dominance. Warfare was endemic. Raids were common. Blood feuds lasted generations. In this world, loyalty to one's immediate family and clan was everything, and alliances were fragile, often breaking as quickly as they were formed. But before we can tell the story of Temüjin himself, we must first tell the story of his mother, for her tale is essential to understanding how he came to be born at all. The story of the man named Temüjin begins in the second half of the 12th century with his mother, a young woman named Alun. She was from the eastern Mongolian steppe, to the southeast of Lake Baikal, and was probably no more than a teenager. She had just married a man named Childu of the Merkit people. This young couple was in love, and she was now traveling back to his homeland, with him, to live with his family in their camp. But things would not go according to the young lovers' plan. On their fateful journey home, they passed through the lands of a warrior named Yasuge, the leader of a small Mongol band on the Great Anan River. Yasuge had once been a powerful leader, but had recently fallen on tough times. That day he was out hunting with his hawk when he saw the marriage procession pass by, and caught sight of the beautiful face of Alun. Yasuge already had a wife, but upon seeing Alun, he became overcome with desire for her. As a Mongol warrior, he was used to taking what he desired. He rode back to his camp and gathered his two brothers, and together they chased after the wedding party with murder in their hearts. When Alun and her husband saw the warrior brothers bearing down on them, she begged her husband to flee and save his life. As the secret history recalls, his bride Madame Alun said to him, Have you understood what those three men are about? Their looks say they want your life. As long as you have your life at least, you will find a woman to wed. Save your life. Childu listened to her pleas and fled across the grasslands, leaving Alun to be captured. The two of them would never see each other again. The three riders chased him from behind over 7 ridges until they drove him off. They came back and Yasuge took Madame Alun by the tether, and she wailed in a great voice. She wailed until the Anan River echoed it, and the wooded valley rang with it. We do not know what happened to Alun's husband Childu, but it seems he never made any attempt to recapture her. In the harsh world of the steppe, a man only had rights to what he could defend, and Alun was now no longer considered his wife. As for Alun, her heartbreak must have been overwhelming, but she seems to have accepted her fate and settled into the new life that Yasuge had forced upon her at the edge of the mountains and the great Siberian forest. Here she would have to be tough to survive. Yasuge already had a wife, and by then this woman had borne him a son named Bektor. Soon Alun too became pregnant and gave Yasuge their first child together. This child was a boy, and it is said that when he came screaming into the world, he was clutching a tiny but fearsome omen in his little hand. When Madame Alun was big with child, just then, when they were at Delium Boldak, on the Anan River, he was born. When he was born clutching a clot of blood in his right hand, the size of a knuckle bone. To the Mongols, this was an unmistakable sign that the boy would grow up to be a warrior. The year was around 1162, in the Chinese calendar, the year of the horse. At the time, the Mongols were at war with another much more powerful steppe people, the Tartars, who lived closer to the border with northern China. Yasuge had recently captured a Tatar warrior named Temüjin Uge in battle, and in celebration of this feat he decided to name the new baby boy after his captured enemy. The name Temüjin likely meant blacksmith or ironworker, but in time it would come to gain a different association, the Iron One, or the Man of Iron. This captured man may even have been executed at the naming ceremony, and his strength ritually given to the new baby boy. From this bloody beginning, Temüjin's childhood was a tough one, but it forged him into the man he would become. Living at Yasuge's camp on the banks of the Annan River, he would have learned to hunt and fish, and of course how to ride a horse from a young age. One Chinese writer describes the life of a stepchild. Even 3-year-old toddlers are secured to the saddle with rope and given something to grasp with their hands so they can follow along as the rest dash about on horseback. In their 4th and 5th years they carry under one arm a small bow and short arrows, and when grown they occupy themselves during all 4 seasons with hunting game. Hunting on the steppe was done using a system known as the nurge or noose, and these grand hunts would take place every year and involve large numbers of different families and kin groups. Every Mongol learned from a young age how to work together with other riders across a vast distance, encircling a huge area of land and driving all the wild animals within it into the center of their ring. Then the noose tightened. They would drive the animals closer and closer together until there was nowhere left to run. Then they would begin to fire hundreds of arrows into the mass of terrified prey. Yasuge would have taught his young sons this skill from a young age, but Temüjin's relationship with his kidnapper of a father may have been a strained one. Yasuge already had an oldest son by another woman, the boy named Bektar, and Bektar seems to have enjoyed reminding Temüjin of his place. When Temüjin was 9 years old, his father clearly worried about the divisions in his family. He decided to take the young boy to find a wife of his own. They traveled out together and met with the ruler of a nearby clan, who was also something of a shaman. He told Yasuge that the boy who rode beside him was destined for great things. "This boy of yours is a boy with flame in his eyes and fire in his face. Last night, I dreamt a dream. A white falcon flew towards me clutching the sun and the moon, and alighted on my hand. This dream of mine was showing me that you would come leading this boy of yours." The chief gave the young boy the hand of one of his daughters, a girl named Borte. She was a year older than him, and at the first sight of her Temüjin fell in love, a love that would never leave him. On his way home, his father Yasuge must have been satisfied. He had found a good wife for his young son, and could now head home to a family made at peace. But fate would conspire against him. That night, he stopped at a camp belonging to some Tartar men. By this time, the Tartars and the Mongols were no longer at war, but they were still bitter rivals. The customs on the steppe stated that whenever someone stopped at your camp, you were required to set your differences aside and offer them hospitality. But these Tartars had other ideas. As the secret history accounts, remembering their early grudge, they plotted murder and mixed in poison for him. Feeling sick on the way, he went for 3 days and arrived at his jur and felt worse. Yasuge said, "My insides feel sick. I fell victim to a plot, and now I feel sick inside." Having spoken, he died. Hearing of this treachery from a rider sent by his dying father, Temüjin rode hard across the steppe, heading home to be with his mother, and left his betrothed Bort behind. The death of Yasuge left this vulnerable family exposed and alone in the cruel world of steppe politics. Yasuge's clan had been a mixture of different peoples, including families of Mongols, known as the Borjigin and Tayakut, and they had little holding them together other than Yasuge's leadership. Now they split into separate parts and departed in all directions, and none of them had any room for a widowed woman and her hungry children. They left Olun and her children behind, alone, destitute, and starving on the banks of the Annan River. As the secret history records, the Tayakut brethren moved camp down along the Annan River to leave behind on the range Madame Olun, the widow, the little ones and boys, the mothers and children. The Tayakut took their livestock, their goats and their sheep, and left them with only the few horses they owned. This was practically a death sentence. When winter came to the steppe, this feeble group would no doubt freeze and run out of food. But, remarkably, that is not what happened. That is because Elun refused to let her children starve. Madame Elun, born both womanly and wise, finding food for her small boys, fixing up her flowing skirts, flying up and down the Anon River's flood, finding wild fruits, crab apples and cherries, filled she the night and day their famished throats. They were well raised on wild garlic and onion, lily bulbs, leeks, and onion leaves. At night, while they ate these meager foods, she told them the stories of her ancestors, the stories that had been passed down to her from her parents, the stories of Alan the Beautiful and her 5 unruly sons, and the parable of the 5 arrows that could not be broken so long as they stayed together. At first the boys seemed to have taken these lessons to heart. Saying to each other, "We must feed our mother," they sat on Mother Anan's muddy banks and mastered metal hooks and lures, catching maimed and motley fish. Turning needles into hooks, they hooked trout and little white fish. They sifted pools for silver minnows, and so they served back their mother's love. It was around this time that Temüjin met another boy of the same age, whose family would often camp near to their own settlement. This boy's name was Jamuka. The 2 boys hunted and fished together and became good friends. In fact, they became so close that they swore to enter into that bond of chosen kinship and became what the Mongols called anda, a kind of blood brother. They most likely spilled a drop of their blood into a cup of fermented mare's milk, and both drank from it, swearing an oath of eternal brotherhood and always to fight on one another's behalf. It must have been hard to imagine at the time watching these 2 skinny boys playing in the hills or at games of knucklebones beside the great river. But one day, they would fight one another in a bitter civil war over who would rule all the people of the Mongols. Soon winter came to the steppe, snow fell, and the Anan River froze solid. The now reduced family must have come close to death, but finally spring arrived on the steppe, and the ice on the grasslands thawed. But by this time, all was not well among this lonely family. Despite their mother's stories warning them to stay united, a bitter rivalry had always existed between Temüjin and Yasuge's oldest son Bektar, who had been born of another mother. This rivalry would only grow bitterer as their situation worsened and hunger set in. As the older and larger boy, Bektar often took for himself the best of the fish and birds that they caught, until eventually Temüjin had had enough. He and his younger brother Khazar soon plotted to kill their older brother. It was not just Bektar's selfishness that motivated this decision. With their father dead, their mother Elun was an unmarried woman. As a result, she was considered available for marriage. And though it might seem strange to us, the most likely candidate may have been her young stepson, Bektar. Traveling to Mongolia a century later, the Venetian explorer Marco Polo noted this peculiarity of Mongol marriage laws. The marriage customs of Tartars are as follows. Any man may take 100 wives if he so please, and if he be able to keep them. But the first wife is ever held most in honor, and as the most legitimate. They may marry their cousins, and if a father dies his son may take any of the wives, his mother always excepted. That is to say, the eldest son may do this, but no other. If Bektar married Elun, he would secure his position as the undisputed head of the family. Temüjin and Khazar were determined not to let that happen. The pair of them chose their moment carefully. They took their bows and crept up on Bektar while he sat on the hill, drawing their bowstrings taut. When he saw them, he briefly pleaded for his life, but they did not listen. Temüjin and Khazar shot him with their arrows and left his body to lie in the long grass of the steppe. When they returned to their tent, their mother saw the murder in their eyes. When they came back into the jur, the Madame Mother understood it all from the faces of her 2 children. "Murderers!" she shouted. When bursting out from my hot womb, he wielded in his hand a black blood clot, like a hound that devours its own, like a panther that pounces against a cliff, like a lion that cannot restrain its wrath, like a wolf that stalks in the whirling blizzard. You killed your own brother. When summer came again that year, their old tribe, the Tayakute, returned following their seasonal route, as always. They must have expected to find nothing but a collection of whitened bones, littering the steppe where they had left the family of Alan and her children to die. But they were astonished, and a little concerned, to find these young men and their mother still living by the side of the river. Somehow they had clung to life. This could turn out to be a problem for the Teüjin. These boys were becoming stronger each year, and maybe one day they would be strong enough to take revenge for abandoning them. Perhaps when the Teüjin heard of Temüjin's killing of Begtar, they used this as an excuse to hunt him down as an outlaw. Temüjin ran, and they chased him high up into the mountains. Fleeing for his life, he made for one peak in particular that held a great significance, the sacred mountain named Burkan Khaldun. Among the rocky slopes strewn with scree, there grow forests of Siberian larch and pine where it was possible for him to hide. For a while, he evaded them among the forest's shady depths, but the Teüjin posted guards in a wide circle and slowly closed the net around him. Eventually, they cornered him and dragged him back to their camp as a prisoner. At first, the Teüjin planned to execute Temüjin, but they soon changed their minds. A young, strong boy like him would make a good worker, and so they brought the young man back to live as a slave in their camp. To humiliate him, they forced him to wear a heavy wooden board around his neck. This prevented him from eating or sleeping comfortably, and made his status as a slave known to everyone. It is not known how long he was held captive here. But all that time, Temüjin must have been thinking of his bride Borte, and dreaming that they would one day be reunited. Eventually, he saw his chance to escape. One night the Teüjin feasted on the Red Disk Day, the 16th of the first moon of summer, on the banks of the Anan as the sun went down. A feeble youth brought him to that feast. As the fellows at the feast were being sent away, he grabbed the wooden board away from the feeble boy, struck him on the head once with it, and ran. He lay down on his back on the river's edge, the moonlight bright as day. With the Teüjin guards combing the steppe for him, Temüjin saw only one chance to escape. He leapt into the icy river, and the heavy wooden board acted as a flotation device. When he climbed out of the water some way downstream, he found a family of herdsmen who helped him to remove the lock on the heavy piece of wood, and he limped back home to his family. Alun and his siblings must have been overjoyed to see him when he returned. But he had other things on his mind. The first thing he did when he returned was to ride out to claim his bride Borte. He must have feared the worst, that her father had gone back on his word and given her to someone else. But perhaps the old shaman had remembered his vision and the fire he had seen in the eyes of that young boy. All those years he had kept his daughter for the man she was promised to. She and Temüjin were married. They had a daughter and lived together happily on the banks of the Anan River. And that is where the story of Temüjin might have ended, with a happy family, with children and grandchildren, with a quiet death in a gyr tent in the middle of the steppe, and we would never know his name. But history had other plans, and the steppe was no place for a quiet life. Chapter 2. The Merkit Raid and the Rise of Alliances. One day a raiding party of the northern forest people, known as the Merkit, swept down on their camp, while Temüjin was out hunting. This raid was a perfect example of the tangled world of steppe rivalries and blood feuds, for in fact these men were the brothers of Childu, the man that Temüjin's mother Alalin had once married, and who had lost his wife to Yasuge. With Yasuge dead, these brothers of Childu were taking their revenge on the man's son instead. They burned his tents and took away his animals, and what possessions he had. And just as Yasuge had once stolen Oilun, these Merkit raiders now stole his wife Borte away, and retreated with her back to the cover of the Siberian forests. With his small band, Temüjin had little hope of reclaiming her, but he did have one chance. That was to reach out to the man who had once been his childhood friend on the banks of the Anan River, a man who was now a rising warrior in the nearby clan of the Karaid, his and a blood brother Jamuka. When Jamuka saw his old friend after so many years, he was overjoyed, but he must have seen the pain in Temüjin's face. When Temüjin told him what had happened, Jamuka flew into a rage. The secret history records him giving the following promise: "A black leather war drum with its booming bellow I have beaten. A steed with swift steps have I saddled. A steel shirt have I worn. A solid spear have I seized. A stinging arrow on my string have I strung. To slaughter all the savage Merkit I set out. The lord that Jamuka served was a man named Genghis Khan, the Khan of the Korean people, and he agreed to help Temüjin get his wife back. They spent that year building an army and set out in the autumn with a host over 30,000 strong, riding north into the hostile forests where the Merkit lived. They waited until nightfall, and then under cover of darkness, they swept down on the Merkit camp in a surprise attack. The secret history records what happens next. They swarmed in to seize his girls in a sudden swoop. They plundered his kingdom mercilessly, as the Merkit folk fled down the Selenge River in the night, as our soldiers dogged the heels of the fugitive Merkit through the night plundering and looting. As Temüjin called out for Borda, Borda, they finally locked eyes with each other, and for what had felt as an eternity, they finally met. Madame Borta was there among the fugitives. She recognized Temüjin's voice, got down from the wagon, and ran towards him, and they hugged each other in welcome. There was only one complication. Temüjin soon found out that his wife Borte had become pregnant. Since she had been captured and forcibly married to a Merkit lord, Temüjin could never know whether the child was his. Perhaps for this reason, when his firstborn son came into the world, Temüjin gave him the name Jochi, which in Mongolian means guest, perhaps alluding to the question of his fatherhood. But they all agreed to put the issue behind them, and Temüjin accepted Jochi the guest as his eldest son. With a heavy heart, Temüjin agreed, and he and his family prepared to leave. He expected to leave with just his wife and his small children, but to his surprise, he had gained a great deal of popularity among Jamuka's people. In fact, when Temüjin made to leave Jamuka's camp, half of his blood brother's followers asked to go with him. The loyalty that Temüjin clearly inspired was partly due to his reputation for generosity. When dividing up the loot from a successful raid, steppe peoples had for thousands of years adhered to an ancient system by which the elites and nobles took all the best plunder for themselves and then divided the rest among the other men as they saw fit. Common people were usually left out of this system. In the harsh world of the steppe, strength was everything, and the strong took the lion's share. But Temüjin appears to have been different. He had grown up on the freezing bank of the Anan River with his siblings, and learned to share everything in common. He had once killed his older brother Bektor, partly for taking the best food for himself, and since then must have harbored a distaste for this ancient system. Perhaps he had learned that inspiring loyalty in those around him was worth any amount of gold, or any number of horses. As a result, he pioneered a new and somewhat radical system in the world of the steppe. In his party, loot would be shared according to merit, and those who did well in battle were given a greater share, even if they were just common people. Among his followers, he also at times introduced a kind of insurance policy, decreeing that any soldier who was killed in battle would have their share of the loot given to their widow and orphaned children, a policy perhaps inspired by his own experience of losing his father and being plunged into poverty as a child. A certain amount of loot was also distributed to the elderly and disabled. All of this meant that when he left Jamuka's camp, a number of men wanted to follow him. But in taking half of his blood brother's people, Temüjin had also gained a powerful enemy. Throughout this time, the Mongols were still a fractured and divided people. But now these two rival warriors both desired to make themselves ruler over all the Mongols, a title that had long been known as Khan. In the summer of 1189, Temüjin decided to take his chance. He summoned a meeting of the clans known as a Kurultai. A Kurultai was a riotous event, part political rally and part festival. This one took place on the shores of a place on the steppe known as the Blue Lake. Here the air would be filled with the sound of horses, laughter, and perhaps the mesmerizing sound of Mongolian throat singing, a unique vocal form in which the singers summon sound from deep in their larynx with such precision that they are able to sing two notes at once. The Kurultai would have included games and feasts, the so-called three manly pursuits of horse races, wrestling and archery tournaments, and of course the consumption of vast quantities of alcohol. It is likely the attendants would have drunk arag or kumis, the alcoholic drink made from fermented mare's milk. One Chinese diplomat named Zhao Gong, who attended a Mongol feast in the early 1220s, even records a kind of Mongol drinking game. They do not end their banqueting until everyone is roaring drunk. Every time they drink wine, it is their custom that those who sit next to each other should, after tasting, exchange cups. If one's counterpart holds the cup with one hand, it means that I must taste a mouthful, and only then will he dare to drink. If he holds the cup in both hands, then he wishes to switch cups with me. Then I have to drink his wine to the bottom and pour wine to toast him. This made it very easy to get drunk. Whenever they see a foreign guest talk uproariously, make noise and act rudely in a drunken state, or else vomit or fall asleep, then they are very happy and say, "The guest gets drunk, so his heart is one with ours." But despite the revelry, the Kurultai had a very serious purpose. By holding this gathering of the clans, Temüjin was declaring his intention to become Khan of the Mongols. This was not a particularly prestigious title. The Mongols were a weak and divided people, and any Khan who led them would still pay tribute to the much more powerful Togaril Khan of the Karaites. But it was still a clear declaration of war against the more likely claimant to the title and the man who commanded the support of most Mongol nobles, his own blood brother, Jamuka. When Jamuka heard news about this Kurultai, he must have been enraged. Clashes between the two men's followers intensified, until one day, one of Jamuka's relatives was killed in a cattle raid. This was the excuse he was looking for to finally go to war and crush his blood brother Temüjin. The two sides gathered their forces. Temüjin would finally meet his blood brother in battle at a place called Dalan Baljut. The Mongol horsemen would have wheeled around each other in great thundering packs, hailing one another with arrows before closing in and clashing with their long lances. We can imagine the thundering of the hooves, the cries of the dying men and horses, the whoops and battle cries, and the angry buzzing of arrows through the air. But here Jamuka's greater experience and years of warrior training easily overpowered the inexperienced Temüjin. The secret history reports this loss in few words. They formed up into 3 units, rode against Jamuka. He was forced back then by Jamuka, and escaped into the Jirin Gorge on the Anan River. With Temüjin defeated, the wrath of Jamuka was terrible. In retribution for siding with the upstart, Jamuka ordered that 70 princes of the Chinoa clan be boiled alive in great iron cauldrons. One leader's head was cut off, and Jamuka tied it to his horse's tail and dragged it behind him as he rode. Temüjin's situation was now worse than ever. He was now an outlaw and fled for his life, with the riders of Jamuka hot on his heels. He would not return to the steppe for another 10 years, and those years are a gap in his biography. But some historians think it likely that he went south to the lands that lay across the great expanse of the Gobi Desert, a domain of large, wealthy cities, artists, merchants, poets, and emperors. The lands of China. China at the end of the 12th century was a divided land. Since the days of the first emperors of the Qin and Han dynasty, the settled people who lived in the floodplains around the Yangtze and Yellow rivers had fought bitterly with the nomadic horse-riding peoples of the steppe, and since that time China's emperors had built numerous defenses on their northern border that would become known as the Great Wall. In the nearly 10 centuries since the time of the Han dynasty, the Tang were the first to unite the area of the central Chinese plains. But after the collapse of that dynasty, a period of chaos and dissolution followed, known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. Eventually, around the year 1000, the plains of China united once more under the Song dynasty. The Song were ethnically Han Chinese, the majority ethnic group of China, and under their reign the people of the Central Plains had flourished. Over the next 100 years China's population would double, so that by the year 1100, more than 100 million people, or 1/3 of the planet's entire human population, could be found there. China at this time was the undisputed center of the world, and technologically the most advanced civilization on Earth. But in the 1120s disaster struck. The Jurchen were a people from the oak and pine forests of Manchuria, near the border with Korea, where Siberian tigers were known to roam, and to the Chinese in the south, these Jurchen were considered barbarians. They were mostly not nomadic and lived in villages, but they were a horse-rearing people, and they rode and fought as horse archers in much the same way as the Mongols. Once subservient to another Manchurian people known as the Khitan, they had overthrown their former masters and now swept across northern China in a tide of conquest. The Chinese Song dynasty, weakened by internal divisions and taken by surprise, could do little to stop them. In a disaster that the Song would rue for centuries, Jurchen horsemen swept south and seized the lands around the northern Yellow River, pushing south and even capturing the former Song capital of Kaifeng. From this point onwards, the lands of northern China would be ruled by these Jurchen, and their new emperor would crown himself with a title that elevated him above the other peoples of the steppe. He was now the Golden Khan, and his empire would be known as the Jin or Golden Empire. The Jurchen Jin dynasty of northern China was what has been called a conquest dynasty, that is, one founded by outside invaders. But throughout Chinese history, these kinds of conquerors had always learned that military might was not the only kind of power. That culture, too, had its own kind of force. Over time, the founders of these conquest dynasties often adopted the Chinese language, began to live by Confucian ideals, and dress in Chinese clothes, intermarry with the locals, and gradually become every bit as Chinese as the Chinese. The Jurchen were no different. In fact, over the century that they ruled northern China, they adopted the Chinese language so enthusiastically that very few written texts in the Jurchen language have survived. Just 30 years after their conquest, one Jin emperor, known as the Prince of Hailing, even began writing Chinese poetry and drinking Chinese tea, something that his hardy forebears would have mocked. But no matter how many Chinese manners or customs they adopted, the Jin would always be considered outside barbarians by the Song Chinese in the south, who referred to them as slaves and dog sheep, and dreamed of one day retaking their lost lands and uniting China once more. For the next 2 centuries, China would be divided into these two halves, the Chinese Song in the rugged and tropical south, and the Jurchen Jin in the dry and arid north, with their border along the Huai River, roughly halfway between the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers. There was almost constant warfare between them as they seized forts and border towns from one another whenever the opportunity arose. But neither side was ever able to gain the upper hand. Since they themselves had once swept out of the wilderness and seized the cities of China, the Jurchen rulers of the Jin dynasty knew all too well how quickly a new threat could develop in those wild lands, and they were determined not to be caught by surprise as the Song had been. As a result, the Jin operated a policy of using nomads to fight nomads. On their frontier, the Jin dynasty employed what were called Juyin. These were their border guards, vassals, and subject states, along with mercenaries, who they paid handsomely to create a buffer zone between them and the other peoples of the north. These giant border guards would raid and plunder other steppe peoples whenever they became too powerful and suppressed any chance of a united power emerging in the Mongolian steppe. When any one group of Jain themselves became too powerful, the Jin would shift their support to a different people and bring them tumbling down in turn. The southern Chinese writer Zhao Gong recounts this practice with the usual Song contempt for their northern rivals. When the Tartars were in their original countries during the Jin coward's reign, there was a rumor spoken. The Tartars are coming. Every 3 years they would dispatch troops to the farthest frontiers and wastes of the north to destroy and kill, and called it decreasing the number of fighting men. The Tartars fled and concealed themselves in the sandy deserts, and hatred entered the marrow of their bones. This brutal policy had been remarkably successful. Constantly beset by punitive raids, the peoples of the north, like the Mongols, had remained bitterly divided, crippled by blood feuds and rivalries, of which the life of Temüjin gives just a glimpse. Zhao Gong describes the chaotic state of the steppe during this time. At present, the Tartars are very simple and wild, and they have almost no institutions. I have studied and researched this, and have found that they prosper and decline rise and are destroyed, with no regularity. The brutal Jin policy had created immense hardship, but they also provided something of a safety net. For any group facing extinction in the steppe, there always remained this one way of surviving: to enter the service of the Jin and defend the borders of their empire. It is thought that after losing his battle with Jamuka, Temüjin may have fled south into the borderlands of the Jin Empire, with what remained of his followers, and there sold his services as a Jain. If this is where Temüjin spent those 10 years, then it is here that he would hone his skills as a leader and strategist, and he would learn lessons in brutality. In the winter of 1196, the Jin paid him to attack the wealthy steppe people known as the Tartars. The Tartars had actually been giant border guards themselves, and had grown rich from all the loot they had plundered on behalf of the Jin. But now the Jin dynasty feared that their loyal attack dogs had become too powerful. They employed Temüjin's Mongols and their overlords, the powerful Karaite people, to attack the Tartars and reduce any threat they might eventually pose. Since the Tartars had once poisoned his father, Temüjin must have been all too happy to accept. As the secret history recalls, when he learned the news, Temüjin said, "From days of old, the Tartars have been a hateful folk who murdered the grandfathers and fathers. In this opportunity, let us join in on this attack." The ruler of the Karaites, Togrul Khan, also had reason to hate the Tartars. He had once been the Anda or blood brother of Temüjin's murdered father, Yasuge, and in this period would become something of a father figure to Temüjin. Together, they rode out against their joint enemy, and in a surprise attack, swept into Tartar lands and plundered them mercilessly. The Mongols were amazed by the rich trade goods they seized from the tents and treasure carts of the Tartars. They noticed that even the children of the Tartars had gold rings in their noses and wore sable cloaks stitched with gold. The Jin dynasty were delighted with Temüjin's work and promoted him to the rank of Zhutao or pacification officer. Looting the Tartars brought his band great wealth, and doubtless more followers too, and it solidified his relationship with the powerful Togrul Khan. From this point on, Temüjin became his right-hand man, and his power began to grow. One people known as the Jurchen had raided some of Temüjin's camps while he was away on his war with the Tartars, and so, when he returned home, he rounded on them. But instead of simply taking their animals and chasing them off, as was usually the way on the steppe, he rounded up their leadership and executed everyone. Then to the common people of the Jurchen he gave an offer to join the Mongols, not as slaves, as would have been usual, but as members of the clan. He even gave his mother an orphan Jurchen boy to adopt, symbolically accepting him as his brother. The Jurchen must have been perplexed, but many of them accepted his deal. This was a new way of doing things on the steppe, and suddenly, the established elite of Mongolia began to get nervous. These old powerful Khans rallied around the one person they thought could challenge Temüjin. In fact, the only man who had ever beaten him in battle, his own blood brother Jamuka. These old Khans gathered and crowned Jamuka with an ancient and powerful title, Gur Khan, meaning something like Khan over Khans. The only thing standing between Jamuka and his final victory was Temüjin. When Temüjin and Jamuka met in battle for the final time, the year was 1201. Both sides gathered their horsemen, who by now would have numbered in the many thousands. Wars in Mongolia were fought with horse and spear, with bow and arrow and sword. One Chinese chronicler, Peng Dia, writes an account of the typical equipment of a Mongol warrior. Their weapons and armor consist of scale armor, chainmail with leather 6 layers deep, and tough sheep horn bows. They whittle wood for the shafts and take down birds of prey for the feathers. Their scimitars follow the Westerner style, light and sharp. They have long and short spears with tips like drills, so that what is speared does not slip off, and they can penetrate heavy armor. They have defensive shields of short-stemmed bamboo, or else of willow tied with leather. But as well as these physical weapons, battles in Mongolia were also fought with magic. Both sides would bring their most powerful shamans to the battlefield, and these holy men were considered to have exceptional abilities at their disposal to turn away enemy arrows, cause their shields and bowstrings to break, and even use enchanted stones to control the weather. The great respect that all Mongols held for these shamans meant that they actually had a very real psychological effect on the battlefield. In a narrow contest that could go either way, an impressive display of shamanic power could even make the difference between an army standing and fighting or panicking and running, between victory and defeat. On the day of the battle, as the horsemen clashed and arrows flew in angry swarms through the air, it was Temüjin's shamans who seemed to win the day. As the battle wore on, the clouds darkened, and a great steppe storm swept down over the blood-stained grasslands. When they were pushing each other back and forth up and down the slope and reforming their own ranks, at that very moment the shamans of Jamuka performed a weather stone magic. But the weather magic reversed, and the magic fell on themselves. Then, saying to each other, "Heaven is not pleased with us," they scattered. Jamuka now fled, just as Temüjin once had. Over the next few years he would regroup with some of his men. But many could now see which way the wind was blowing. Some of Jamuka's followers betrayed him, hoping that if they handed him over to Temüjin, they would curry favor with the new ascendant lord of the steppe. When they came to Temüjin with their captive, however, they were disappointed. For their reward, Temüjin had them all put to death, condemning them in the following terms: "People who laid hands on their own ruler, how can they be allowed to live? Who would befriend such people? Execute them all down to their offspring." But his rival Jamuka could not be allowed to live. Despite their sworn bond, Temüjin ordered that he be killed, perhaps as a sign of the love they had once held for one another. The deed was done in the most noble manner according to Mongol tradition, that is, without shedding any of his blood. Jamuka was likely strangled or his back broken, and his body was buried. With the killing of Jamuka, Temüjin's childhood died too, and a new man was born. The war of the Khans had come to an end, and now Temüjin's claim to be Khan of all the Mongols faced no opposition. Before long, other peoples of the steppe fell before his horsemen: the Naiman, the Jadaran, the Oirat, the Tayakut, and the Tartars. In each clan that fell to him, the elites and nobles were killed. But as with the Jurchen, the commoners were absorbed into the Mongol army, and Temüjin's mother, Oelin, would ceremoniously adopt an orphaned child of their people as Temüjin's brother. As a system, it was immensely symbolic and ruthlessly effective. Eventually, even his mentor Togril, the Khan of the Karayat, recognized how powerful his protege had become. He turned on Temüjin and tried to have him killed, but he too was swept aside. Now around the age of 70, Togril was defeated at a clash remembered as the Battle of the Burning Sands. Now there was no one left to stand in Temüjin's way. Temüjin was the undisputed overlord of virtually all the peoples of Mongolia and the commander of as many as 100,000 horsemen. In a grand Kuriltai ceremony in the year 1206, he gathered all the peoples he had conquered and declared himself the emperor of the eastern steppe. When he was crowned, he chose to rule not with the old traditional title of Gur Khan that Jamuka had chosen, but with a new title. This title would symbolize that things in the world of the steppe were about to change, that Temüjin would be the kind of ruler that Asia had never seen before. The meaning of this title is much debated and meant something like Great Khan, Righteous King, or Oceanic Emperor. But soon it would be known all around the world. A title that in the Mongolian language was pronounced Genghis Khan. Chapter 3. The Title and the Transformation. The title that Temüjin chose to rule under has suffered much from translation through the ages. From Mongolian, it entered the Persian language relatively unscathed as Genghis Khan. But when these sources were translated into Arabic, the confusion began. Arabic has no ch sound, and so they used their letter J to make it Genghis Khan. European scholars would later translate these sources into Latin and eventually into English in the 19th century, at which time the translators used the letter G to denote a soft sound like in general or German. But due to the ambiguous pronunciation of the letter G in English, this soon led to an extremely common mispronunciation: Genghis Khan. The mispronunciation is so widespread today that Genghis Khan has arguably become the standard way that the name is pronounced in English. But for the sake of correctness in this episode, I will pronounce the name Genghis as it is said in Mongolia today. Beyond the pronunciation of his name, much else is mysterious about the figure of Genghis Khan, not least his appearance. No artistic representations were ever made of him during his life, or by anyone who met him. As a result, those imaginary depictions we do have are deeply influenced by the artist's cultural background. In one Chinese portrait of the Great Khan, made after his death, he appears painted like a Chinese emperor wearing a white Mongolian-style robe. Meanwhile, in the Persian miniature paintings, he is depicted wearing a great golden crown, or later as a Persian prince with a feathered turban, necklaces of pearls, or dressed in fine silk and brocades. In Europe too, he would be depicted with European features, with fine fur cloaks and a gown of flowing silk, sporting a handsome mustache. Written descriptions of him could be no less fragmentary. The Chinese writer Zhao Gong writes one rare account of his appearance. On the whole, the Tartars are not very tall, the tallest not exceeding 5 feet and 3 or 4 inches. They grow extremely little facial hair. The Tartar Lord Temüjin differs in that he is of a large and noble bearing with a broad forehead and long whiskers and cuts a heroic, robust figure. The 13th century Persian writer Minhaj al-Siraj Juzjani writes another rare description of what he looked like, although he got his account third-hand and never saw the Great Khan himself. A man of tall stature, of vigorous build, robust in body, the hair on his face scanty and turned white, with cat's eyes, possessed of dedicated energy, discernment, genius, and understanding. Awe-striking, a butcher, just, resolute, an overthrower of enemies, intrepid, bloodthirsty, and cruel. He was adept at magic and deception, and some of the devils were his friends. Historians have never settled exactly what Juzjani means when he says that Genghis Khan had cat's eyes. This may have referred to the epicanthic folds that are typical of the faces of Mongolians and many peoples in East Asia, and may have been worthy of mention to the Persian chronicler. But it may also indicate that Genghis Khan had a striking and unusual eye color, perhaps a bright yellow that occurs in rare cases with a higher incidence in East Asia. Throughout these sources, Genghis Khan is elusive, insubstantial, and mysterious. But the changes he brought about in the world would be immense. After conquering much of the world of the steppe, the man who was once Temüjin began the work of building a state. The empire that Genghis Khan would forge, he would call the Yeke Mongol Ulus, or the Great Mongol State. But he also referred to it informally and affectionately as the people of the felt walls, referring to the felt tents that characterized the nomadic way of life. The empire was a vast confederation covering a land area roughly the size of Western Europe, and comprising at least 1 million people and probably 20 million herd animals. But it was an empire of grass, an empire without cities, without governors or administrators. To make sense of this organizational nightmare, Genghis Khan embarked on a dramatic restructuring of Mongol society. He would tear out the old system of clan loyalties and replace it with one based around the military. He organized his warriors according to an old decimal system that had been used for centuries on the steppe going back to the time of the Ayamnu. His soldiers were placed into squads of 10 men, called an arban, who lived together and fought as brothers. These squads were typically led by the eldest man. 10 of these arban joined together to make a zagun or 100 men, and these 100 voted to choose its leader. 10 zagun made a mingan or 1,000 men, and 10 mingan made a tumen, an army of 10,000 Mongol horsemen. This was considered to be a practical size, large enough to be effective in battle, but not so large that it could not move quickly or ran into problems with supply. The leaders of these tumen were chosen by Temüjin personally. In this way, the old messy clan system, which had fostered infighting and backstabbing, had been replaced by a regimented system that promoted coordination and cooperation. The Persian scholar Atta Malik Juvani, writing in the service of the Mongols in the 1250s, gushes about the great success of these reforms. God Almighty in wisdom and intelligence distinguished Genghis Khan in alertness of mind and absoluteness of power, and exalted him above all the kings of the world, so that all that had been recorded touching the ways of the pharaohs and Caesars was by Djenghis Khan invented from the page of his own mind. He established a rule for every occasion and a regulation for every circumstance, while for every crime he fixed a penalty. Every Mongol of all ages and genders were now required to give 1 day a week of public service, either in the army or working on public projects. These could be herding animals and collecting milk, gathering dung for fuel, or making felt from wool. Sometimes their service could simply be to serve food at a feast or to sing and entertain the troops. Genghis Khan worked to end the feuding that had for centuries defined the harsh reality of Mongol life. Previously, the only justice on the steppe was the vengeance you could exact on those who wronged you, which had the tendency to bring about cycles of reprisal and violence that echoed down the generations. But Temüjin introduced a series of laws that he would call the Great Law, or Yassa. Since the Mongols had no written script, they adopted the writing system of the nearby Uyghur people and copied these laws down in a series of books with bright blue bindings. As the Persian scholar Juvayni recalls, these rolls are called the Great Book of the Yassa and are kept in the treasury of the chief princes. Whenever a Khan ascends the throne, or a great army is mobilized, or the princes assemble and begin to consult together concerning affairs of state and the administration thereof, they produce these rolls and model their actions thereon. Each one of the new laws that Genghis Khan wrote seemed to be directly influenced by his own experiences in earlier life. One of his first laws was to forbid the kidnapping of women on the Mongol steppe. He had come close to losing his wife Borte in this way, and knew the pain of it firsthand, and his own mother Ailun had been kidnapped by his father. In this way, it must have been a deeply personal issue, but kidnapping was also one of the main causes of friction on the steppe, and had sparked countless bitter feuds. Outlawing it completely would bring peace, where before there had been only conflict. He also outlawed the taking of other Mongols as slaves. After being kept as a slave by the Temüjin, this issue seems to have arisen from his own bitter memories. Although there would be no law against taking slaves from other steppe peoples, he also outlawed the theft of animals and brought in regulations on when people could hunt, banning hunting throughout the breeding season, so that stocks of game animals would not become depleted. Finally, he began the introduction of what would become a law that guaranteed a degree of religious protection to his subjects, perhaps the first law of its kind in the Middle Ages. As Juvayni records, being the adherent of no religion and the follower of no creed, he rejected bigotry and the preference of one faith to another, and the placing of some above others. Rather, he honored and respected the learned and the pious of every sect, recognizing such conduct as the way to the court of God. These laws may sound idealistic to us today, but they were also pragmatic. Religious conflicts could cause ruptures between different families and clans and damage the cohesion of the empire. But now all the steppe peoples, whether Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, or like him, a worshipper of Tengri and the great blue sky, would all share equal protection under the law. Certain religious practices like the slaughter of halal meat were outlawed, sometimes on penalty of death. So it has been contested how much we can really call this religious freedom. But it was still a radical new vision for what kind of state the Mongol Empire could be. On top of these reforms, Genghis Khan created a new inner heartland for the empire. This was the original homeland of the Mongols, the region where the rivers Anan, Kurlan, and Tul found their source, and where he had once sheltered from the Temüjin warriors who had hunted him. This was the land centered around the mountain Burkan Khaldun. Only members of his close family and inner court were allowed to venture into this private land, and it was here that Mongol royalty would bury their dead for centuries to come. At the head of Mongol society sat Genghis Khan and his inner court, which in Mongolian was known as an ordu, a word that means something like great tent, and is the origin of the English word horde. The word Mongol itself has a somewhat uncertain origin, perhaps deriving from the Mongolian phrase Mongke Tengri Gal, meaning eternal sky fire, or from the word Mongu, meaning silver. It had been used for some time, about all the scattered clans like Yasuges and Temüjins. But now everyone who lived in the empire was considered a Mongol citizen. But much to the Mongols' frustration, they struggled to get anyone outside of the steppe to call them by that name. For much of their history, people in China, Persia, the Middle East and Europe all insisted on calling them by the name of what had been up until then the largest and most powerful of the steppe peoples, the Tartars. They did this sometimes out of calculated disrespect and sometimes out of genuine confusion. And despite Mongol insistence that they were not Tartars but Mongols, the name stuck. Still, despite all the reforms of Genghis Khan, Mongol society still remained a fragile entity, and its people still lived lives of poverty and subsistence in the harsh land of the steppe. Genghis Khan knew that his people would remain united only as long as they had an enemy to fight together, and if no such enemy arose, they would return to their old ways, fight one another, and tear his new empire apart. Partly for this reason, he began to cast his gaze beyond the high plateau of the Mongolian steppe and hunger for wars of conquest and the riches they could bring. Chapter 4. The Campaign Against Western Kashio. While the Jin and Song divided the river plains of China between them, there was a third smaller kingdom to their west, known as the Western Xia. This was located partly in the hilly upper reaches of the Yellow River and the dry desert regions to the north of the Tibetan Plateau, known as the Hexi Corridor. This had been a strategic trade route for the past 1,000 years since the time of the Han Dynasty, and it is through this narrow passage that the vast majority of Silk Road goods passed on huge caravans of Bactrian camels. Like the Jin, Western Xia were a conquest dynasty ruled by a people known as the Tanguts, nomadic Buddhists from the region of Tibet. Their society was a hybrid, including both nomadic herders not unlike the Mongols and the settled cities full of Chinese, Turkic, and Tibetan peoples, with a booming economy based on Silk Road trade. This was the smallest and weakest kingdom bordering the steppe, and it had recently sheltered some enemies of Genghis Khan who had fled from his conquest. For this reason, the Tanguts were the first prey upon which he set his sights. At first, the Mongols initiated a series of raids on their border forts, testing their defenses. But in the year 1209, Genghis Khan gathered his horde and descended on their borders. When they got news that the Khan was marching on their lands, the Tanguts sent out messengers begging for help from their neighbors, the powerful Jin and Song dynasties in the south. But neither the Jin nor the Song sent any aid. The ruler of the Jin dynasty, known as Prince Shao of Wei, is even recorded to have sent the following dismissive reply: "It is to our advantage when our enemies attack one another. Wherein lies the danger to us?" As we will see, this pattern would repeat itself in almost all the lands that the Mongols arrived in. At various points, a coordinated and united response might have stopped their advance, but everywhere, local rivalries prevented anyone from uniting against them. In the desert regions, the Mongols easily overwhelmed the Tangut armies, but the walled cities of Western Xia proved to be a much greater obstacle. The Mongols had no siege equipment, no ladders or battering rams, no catapults or engineers, and so all they could do was surround the fortresses, gaze up at their towering walls, and try to starve the Tangut people into surrender. This was highly unpalatable for Mongol warriors who delighted in moving quickly, striking fast, and always finding new grasslands for their horses. The Mongols encircled the Tanguts in their capital of Yinchuan, but it was a powerful fortress guarded by an army of 150,000 soldiers. At the sight of the Mongol army, the Tanguts simply disappeared behind their walls and refused to be baited out for battle. In an act of desperation at one point, the Mongols even attempted to dam the Yellow River in the hope of redirecting it into the city, flooding it, and undermining the foundations of its walls. But the river instead flooded the Mongols' camp. Still, the Tanguts had enough of the destruction and soon sued for peace. The secret history of the Mongols records their plea to the great Khan: "If Genghis Khan shows us favor, then we the Tangut people shall bring forth many camels reared in the shelter of the tall feather grass. We shall weave woolen material and make satin, and then we shall give them to you." Training falcons to fly loose at game, we shall gather them, and all the best ones we shall send to you. Sources in Southern Song, China recorded the subjugation of the Tanguts, with a mixture of contempt and amusement. From their perspective, a hated rival had been bested by mere barbarians. The songwriter, Li Xinchuan, records this event with a sneer. The Black Tartars became increasingly powerful. Having gradually unified the clan lands, they then raised a great army and attacked Hexi. Within several years, all the districts and prefectures of Hexi had been sacked. They even forcibly carried off a false princess of the Xia kingdom. In departing, and the Western Xia actually had to serve them as vassals. In the decade that followed, the situation would not seem so amusing to the Song. The conquest of the Western Xia had proven the effectiveness of the Mongol war machine, but it had also exposed a number of glaring weaknesses. Walled cities had frustrated and slowed the Mongol advance, and it became clear that if they hoped to tackle even larger prey, something would have to change. One Chinese writer, Xu Ting, records how the Mongol conquest of the Tanguts set the stage for ever greater expansion. The Tartars in the beginning were primitively ignorant and lacked even a single of the known crafts. Only later, when they conquered the Westerners, did they begin to have products, craftsmen, and mechanisms. The craftsmanship of the Westerners is extremely refined. Especially fine are their instruments of siege warfare. But the Tanguts simply ruled over the trade corridor that transported the goods from east to west. Genghis Khan knew that even greater wealth could be found in the lands where those goods were actually produced, the lands of China. All he needed was an excuse for war, and that would come with the death of the Golden Khan of the Jin dynasty in the year 1208. Chapter 5. The Invasion of the Jin Empire. When the old Golden Khan of the Jin died, his young son, Prince Shao of Wei, took the China throne. This young man had heard of the rise of Genghis Khan to the north of the Gobi Desert, the mysterious character who had united the peoples of the steppe, but it had so far not particularly troubled him, other than the annoying fact that this new ruler had stopped paying him tribute. The new Golden Khan ruled a sprawling empire of more than 50 million people, perhaps the most populous and powerful in the world at the time. Their armies totaled 600,000 men, mostly comprised of armored pikemen and crossbowmen. They commanded perhaps the most technologically advanced forces on Earth, even experimenting with early gunpowder weaponry. And on top of that, their steppe roots in the region of Manchuria meant that they still fielded a mighty cavalry force of more than 150,000 horsemen, dispersed as cavalry divisions among their various armies. The Mongols looked weak in comparison. Their forces totaled no more than about 100,000 horse archers, with not a single foot soldier among them. And the Jin were confident that no one could lead an army across the Gobi Desert large enough to threaten them. For this reason, this young Jin emperor had every reason to be confident. One Song Chinese writer, Zhao Gong, recalls their attitude. The Jin said about the Tartars, "Our country is like the sea. Your country is like 2 handfuls of sand. How could you shake us?" The Tartars to this day, young and old, can all remember these words. It is perhaps this confidence that would lead to the terrible mistake he would make in the year 1210. Every new emperor began his reign by sending out envoys to the empire's subjects, those kingdoms and peoples who had sworn allegiance to his father, to ask them to swear loyalty to him in turn and recommit to whatever tribute they had previously been paying. As part of this process, he sent one envoy across the Gobi Desert to demand that their previous giant border guard Genghis Khan come south and make a gesture of loyalty and submission to the new Golden Khan of the Jin. When the envoys arrived, they would have met with Genghis Khan, who was now nearly 50 years old. If he had ever seen the value in bowing and scraping to the lords of the south, those days were now very much behind him. When the Chinese envoys met him, they asked him to send word of submission to the Jin. The later Chinese source, the Yuan Shi, describes what happened next. Genghis Khan asked the Jin messengers, "Who is the new emperor?" The messengers of the emperor replied, "The Prince of Wei." Genghis Khan turned his face to the south, spat in that direction, and said, "I thought that the emperor of the Middle Kingdom should be a man blessed by heaven. Can he be such an ordinary and weak man? Why should I show him respect?" Then he mounted his horse and rode to the north. The Jin envoys left shaken at their encounter, and Genghis Khan deliberated on his course of action. His insult to the Jin would likely bring a military response, that is, unless he moved first. But he must have been full of doubts and fears about taking on such a powerful enemy. To find the best course of action, he would need to speak to his god. To do this, he climbed up the slopes of the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, through the forests of larch and elegant Siberian pine, and there on its stony peak, surrounded by twisted rock formations, he prayed to Tengri, the god of the great blue sky, to ask him what to do. According to the secret history, when the sun rose on the fourth day, Genghis Khan emerged with his answer. The eternal blue sky has promised us victory and vengeance. In the spring of 1211, the vast horde of the Mongols gathered and set out on its march south, across the Gobi Desert. The sight of this force would have been terrifying. Overhead, pennants and banners flew, and at the head of the army flew the great spirit banner of Genghis Khan, woven from the tail hairs of hundreds of black horses. Every Mongol warrior rode with 5 spare mounts at a time. So with an army of 100,000 horsemen, they would have brought with them an extra 500,000 horses, and probably the same number of sheep and goats. With them also came giant supply carts pulled by as many as 20 oxen and thousands of Bactrian camels, some carrying enormous drums that were beaten to signal the men and rally them for battle. This was an invasion force, but it was also a mass migration, an enormous traveling city designed to flatten everything in its path. The people who would have stood and watched this pandemonium approaching across the desert in a great cloud of dust were known as the Ongut. They were a desert people that for years had been serving as Julian border guards for the Jin, keeping their empire safe from steppe raiders. But upon seeing the enormous Mongol army approaching, the Ongut reassessed their position. These border nomads welcomed the Mongols as brothers, and even showed them the most direct route, south through the narrow mountain passes, right into the heart of the Jin lands. The invasion of China had begun. The Mongol strategy was always to attack in multiple places at once, sowing maximum fear and confusion, and giving the appearance that their forces were much more numerous than they were. For this reason, while Genghis Khan led his forces in the west, his general Jabe led an army into the east. The Song Chinese writer Zhao Gong describes what happened next. Temüjin, indignant over their bullying and insults, invaded the frontier. The frontier prefectures were all conquered and their people killed. The Mongols took these border forts and then crossed through the mountains. They first met Jin resistance at a place called Bajor's Mouth Pass, and there they smashed the Jin army sent to face them. The Mongols broke through the mountains by autumn of 1211 and spilled out into the Chinese heartland. For the next 3 years, the Mongols pillaged the entire North China plain, and for much of this time the Jin were powerless to stop. Part of the reason for this was the immense mobility of Mongol armies. Jin armies were enormous and well-equipped, but they were also slow. Typically containing twice as many infantry as cavalry, they lumbered across the land at a snail's pace and needed to be constantly supplied with food brought by wagon along precarious supply routes. Meanwhile, the Mongols could disappear and reappear anywhere they liked, allowing them to ambush and destroy whole Jin armies in the field. And everything the Mongols needed, they brought with them. Their horseback armies lived on milk and meat from their animals, and in times of difficulty would even open up a vein on their horses' necks and drink the blood directly from their mounts. They would place strips of raw meat under their saddles in the morning, so that the flesh was tenderized throughout the day of riding so that it could be eaten raw in the evening. In this way, they could camp without lighting fires that would give away their position to enemy scouts. One Jin officer, Tushanyi, gave the following appraisal of the desperate situation. Since the Mongolian army is on horseback, it goes into the plain in only one body, but we defend ourselves divided. Our defeat is certain. The Mongols relied on surprise and deception in a way that completely blindsided the Jin generals, who conducted their wars according to a long-established system of martial honor. One Song Chinese writer named Peng Dia describes their array of inventive and unscrupulous tactics. The Tartars do things that are not addressed in the ancient techniques. If the enemy puts up a strong defense that all the Tartars' plans fail to penetrate, they drive cattle at them or lash wild horses toward them, using animals to disturb the enemy's ranks. Seldom does it fail to defeat them. When their own troops are few, sometimes the Tartars will drag branches behind them, making dust rise to the heavens, and leading the enemy to suspect that their troops are many. When victorious, they dog the enemy's tail until the last man is killed, not permitting any to escape. But if they are the ones defeated, they scatter in all four directions beyond pursuit. The Mongols had learned how to turn the Jin's great strengths against them. One of these strengths was their large population, and the other their powerful walled cities. But these could also be weaknesses. The Mongols exploited these by borrowing tactics that they had learned hunting animals on the steppe. They would devastate the countryside for miles around, which drove vast numbers of refugees towards the only safe places left, the walled cities. Soon they would be flooded with desperate and hungry people, and their storehouses ran out of food. These mighty fortresses now became tombs from which no one could escape. The Mongols also rounded up huge numbers of peasants from the countryside and forced them to work, filling in defensive ditches and moats, pushing siege engines, and dismantling the city's defenses. Each Mongol warrior was tasked with gathering up 10 peasants for this purpose. The defenders on the city walls were left with the brutal choice of allowing their defenses to be destroyed by these unwilling laborers, or use up their arrows to slaughter their own people. The Chinese writer Li Jinchuan describes this ruthless tactic. In the cities, villagers were drafted as soldiers and sent up onto the walls to defend them. The Tartars drove their family members onto the attack, and fathers and sons, and older and younger brothers would often shout at each other from afar in mutual recognition. For this reason, the people had no will to fight, and all the walled towns that the Tartars reached surrendered at the first drum roll. Prisoners of war were also conscripted to fight for their Mongol captors, with the promise that if they proved themselves in battle, they would be freed and allowed to join the Mongol army. But despite their reputation for brutality, Genghis Khan and his warriors also practiced the judicious use of restraint. Sieges were costly and time-consuming, and he hoped that by showing mercy to those cities that surrendered without a fight, he would increase the likelihood of others doing the same. Cities that opened their gates to the Mongols were thoroughly looted of their treasure, but their people were spared. Still, those cities that resisted were slaughtered mercilessly, and in the countryside the death and destruction was rampant. As Li Jinchuan describes, the massacre of the people was almost total. Gold, silk, boys, girls, cattle, sheep, horses, and other livestock, all were rolled up like a mat and carried off. Houses and cottages were burned down. The walls and ramparts became deserted ruins. It is likely that the Mongols had not intended to undertake a full invasion of China, but more like a series of large raids into these wealthy lands. But the more success they met with, the longer they decided to stay. As the war entered its second and third years, and the Mongol army still rampaged unchecked, the Jin became desperate. They began drafting civilians into their army en masse, and even pardoned any criminal who would take up arms and fight. But the Mongols could not be stopped. Soon, they were pushing far enough south to reach the Jin capital on the site of modern Beijing, then known as Zhongdu. They laid eyes on the walls of the city in the year 1214, 3 years after the war had started. Beijing at the time was among the largest cities on Earth. Records show that it had a population of nearly 1 million people and was defended by an 18-kilometer rectangle of rammed earth walls, rising up to 12 meters high, broken by 12 gates and 900 guard towers, ringed by a triple moat. Its walls were topped with powerful crossbows and trebuchets, capable of hurling projectiles more than 300 meters. The Mongols laid siege of the city, but had little success in breaking through its defenses. Even for them, this final prize must have seemed like a step too far. They were now dangerously overstretched, a long way from home, and facing some of the world's most formidable fortifications. On top of that, the climate did not suit them. Summer in this part of the world was hot, and plague was beginning to spread among their army. Their men and horses were exhausted, and they increasingly longed to return to the cool lands of Mongolia. Genghis Khan sent word to the Jin emperor that he was willing to accept terms for peace, with the following demands for tribute. God has made you so weak that should I further molest you, I fear how heaven would judge me. I am willing to withdraw my army. What provision will you make to still the demands of my officers? Many in the Jin court urged the emperor to keep fighting. They argued that the shame of surrendering to these barbarians would be too great for the dynasty to bear, and the city of Beijing could never be taken while a determined force defended it. But luckily for the Mongols, the political situation in the Jin Empire was rapidly disintegrating. Having lost the confidence of his court after 2 years of failure, the young Golden Khan of the Jin, the Prince of Wei, had been assassinated the year earlier, and his nephew was placed on the throne by a military coup. This man named Xuanzong of Jin was now facing another plot in the palace that threatened to topple him. Rather than deal with both the Mongols and his own treacherous courtiers, he decided to finally sue for peace. He accepted a humiliating series of conditions, recognizing himself as a vassal to Genghis Khan, giving the Khan one of his daughters to marry, and massive amounts of gold, silver, and silk, along with 500 young men and women of the court to take away as slaves. With these crushing terms, the war came to an end. The lands of northern China breathed a sigh of relief, and the Mongols rode north towards the Gobi Desert and home. The Jin emperor had seemingly averted further disaster, but he would soon make a critical mistake. Summer was still here, and the Gobi Desert was too hot to cross. For that reason, Genghis Khan camped on the southern side of the desert and waited for the cool months to come before they could return to Mongolia with the vast treasure of their successful raid in tow. But then the Khan got news of something that would send him flying into a rage. Word reached him that the new Jin emperor was fleeing Beijing. The embattled ruler was taking his forces, and what remained of his treasury with him, and retreating far into the south to the old fortress of Kaifeng, on the other side of the Yellow River, an obstacle that the Mongols had not yet been able to cross. This seemed like a clear sign that the Jin did not intend to keep their word. One chronicler recalls the enraged words of Genghis Khan. The Jin emperor made an agreement with me, but now he has moved his capital south. Evidently, he mistrusts my word and has used the peace to deceive me. Instead of crossing the desert and returning to his own lands, Genghis Khan wheeled his forces back around and marched once again to the capital of Beijing. The writer Li Xinchuan describes what happened next. In Moon 5, the Jin ruler moved the capital to Kaifeng. The Tartars heard about this and said to move right away after making peace. This shows they are suspicious and still harbor resentment. They purposely talked peace only as a means to forestall us. In the autumn Moon 8, they again led troops to attack the counties and prefectures of the Central Plains. With the emperor gone along with all his personal troops, the city's people were left all but defenseless. The remaining citizens' garrison of Beijing held out for 8 agonizing months of siege. Starvation soon spread. The Jin made several attempts to relieve the city from the south, but each army they sent was intercepted and ambushed on the road. For the city's defenders, it soon became clear that no reinforcements would be coming. On this realization, whole divisions of Jin soldiers, particularly of the semi-nomadic Khitan people, simply switched sides and joined the Mongols. On the 1st of June 1215, the Mongols finally broke through the walls. As a punishment for holding out so long and for the betrayal of the Jin emperor, the Mongols sacked the city and huge numbers of its people were put to the sword. The writer Li Xinchuan describes the destruction. The grandeur and beauty of Beijing's palaces were the crowning achievement of ancient and modern times. When the Tartars saw them, they were so stunned and frightened, they did not dare look up. Yet not long afterward, the fires set by their soldiers would burn for over a month. What had once been the Golden Jin Empire now fractured into countless feuding warlords fighting over territory, some loyal to the Mongols, others defecting to the Song Chinese in the south, and many others still simply out for themselves. All imperial authority, north of the Yellow River, collapsed. One Jin dynasty poet, a blind man named Zhao Yuan, wrote a poem about this time that he called the Song of Helplessness. The eastern barbarians charge and raid the fields of the western mountains. God willing they will fester, but how so, I do not ever know. As I sip wine and watch the years fleet by, I stumble drunk atop the plateau and sing the song of helplessness. With Beijing in ruins, Genghis Khan left one of his generals behind in China to mop up the remnants of the Jin, but it would not be as easy as he thought, and the final conquest of northern China would take many more years. In the south, the Song Chinese watched the destruction with delight. Their old enemies had been utterly smashed with the delightful irony that it had come at the hands of another barbarian people. The writer Zhao Gong describes with amusement how members of the former Jin government and royal family were now reduced to the level of manual laborers. There are great men of the vanquished Jin who have gotten mixed up in odd jobs, falling as low as butchering and peddling, or leaving to become bandits. All of them are still referred to by their old government titles. One family has a number of men who push carts around the towns, and who still call themselves Commissioner of Transport. The destruction of the Mongol invasion left its marks everywhere in the landscape. City walls had been torn down. In places, crops had been destroyed, since the Mongols deliberately rode their horses over the fields so that the land could return to pastures for their animals. And the event sent reverberations around the world. Sometime afterwards, a delegation of diplomats traveled to China from the region of Central Asia to investigate what had happened. They arrived at the ruins of Beijing, and the scenes of carnage that they witnessed they later related to the Persian scholar Djenghis, who recounts them like something out of a nightmare. When we arrived near to the seat of the government of the Golden Khan, from a considerable distance a high white mound appeared in sight. We supposed that white eminence was perhaps a hill of snow, and we made inquiries of the guides and the people of that part about it. They replied, "The whole of it is the bones of men slain." When we had proceeded onwards another stage, the ground had become so greasy and dark from human fat that it was necessary for us to advance another 3 stages on that same road until we came to dry ground again. Through the infections arising from that ground, some of our party became ill, and some perished. When they reached the city walls, they found similar scenes of slaughter. On reaching the gate of the city, we perceived in a place under a bastion of the citadel an immense quantity of human bones collected. Inquiry was made, and people replied that on the day the city was captured, 60,000 young girls threw themselves from this bastion of the fortress and destroyed themselves in order that they might not fall captive into the hands of the Mongol forces, and that all these were their bones. The scholar Djenghis was a fierce critic of the Mongols and has been criticized for his colorful exaggerations that occur throughout his writings. He did not witness these scenes himself and may have exaggerated stories told to him. But either way, it is clear that the destruction of the Jin dynasty left a terrible human toll. When summer ended, Genghis Khan rode back across the Gobi Desert with all the gold and assorted riches of northern China packed on the backs of his camels, leaving untold suffering behind him. The bounty of silk alone was so great that Mongol soldiers ran out of uses for it. They began to use it as packing material and rope to tie up their horses, and use silver jugs as water troughs for their animals. Precious metals, slaves, and other treasure poured north back to Mongolia in a river of gold that seemed never to end. The year was 1215. In the Chinese calendar, the year of the pig, and the Mongol Empire was now among the wealthiest on earth. Chapter 6. The Khwarezmian Trade Mission. History has remembered Genghis Khan as a bloodthirsty conqueror, a man hell-bent on subjugating the known world. But in fact, most sources suggest that when he left China, conquest was not the first thing on his mind. In fact, he seemed satisfied. He had made his people wealthier than they had ever dreamed and destroyed all nearby rivals. He now controlled a vast swathe of territory that covered almost the entire length of the Mongolian steppe and the Silk Road trade that flowed across it. The Persian scholar Atta Malik Juvayni elegizes this time of relative peace. In the latter part of his reign, he had brought about complete peace and quiet and security, and tranquility, and had achieved the extreme of prosperity and well-being. The roads were secure and disturbances allayed, so that whatever profit or gain was displayed in the uppermost west or the furthermost east, their merchants would bend their steps. Genghis Khan's empire now connected the wealthy production areas of Song China with the rich markets of Persia, Central Asia, and the Near East, and he wanted to make the most of this profitable route. When it came to the settled societies that bordered him, he seems to have treated his neighbors not as enemies to be conquered, but as potential future customers. For years now, he had been exchanging diplomatic missions with his neighbors to the west. And in the year 1218, this culminated in the sending of a great trade delegation. This was a caravan of hundreds of Bactrian camels along with 450 merchants, led by an Indian man named Jafar, who were ordered to head into the west and contact the wealthy empires that existed there in what is today Iran, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. With them, they brought an enormous wealth of goods to trade. As Djenghis recounts with perhaps some of his characteristic exaggeration, among the rarities and presents that the Genghis Khan sent was a nugget of pure gold as big as a camel's neck. Also, he dispatched 500 camels laden with gold, silver, and silks, beaver furs, sable, and elegant and ingenious things of China and the desert regions. This trade delegation was a clear statement of the new empire's power and wealth, all of it looted from the coffers of northern China. It is likely that a large portion of the Mongol elite had invested their treasure in this expedition and had bet heavily on its success. For this reason, Genghis Khan's reputation among the Mongol lords was also at stake. During the cooler autumn months, this trade caravan traveled for several weeks through Mongolia, across the Altai Mountains and over the grasslands and deserts of what is today Kazakhstan. Finally, in November, they arrived at the border of what was then the largest Muslim kingdom in the world, the Empire of Khwarezm. Khwarezm was a relatively new power. Only a century earlier, it had been a small kingdom centered on the powerful city of Genghis in the Khwarezmian oasis. Here the lands are watered by the two great rivers Sirdarya and Amu Darya, which flow down from the Tian Shan Mountains of Kyrgyzstan and the Pamir Mountains north of the Hindu Kush. The oasis cities along these two rivers, Balkh and Bukhara, Samarkand and Merv, were enticing stops after the long weeks on the desert roads, and for centuries they had swelled with wealth from Silk Road trade. With these riches, they had irrigated their arid lands until they bloomed and fed vast and thriving populations. But over the preceding century, the Turkic rulers of Genghis had formed a fruitful partnership with the nomadic people known as the Kipchaks, and had recently used their powerful cavalry armies to expand into Turkmenistan and Afghanistan and spilled south into the mountains of Persia. The Khwarezmian Empire was now the largest and wealthiest Muslim power on the planet. The Persian scholar Abdulmalik Juvayni records the beauty of this region. Khwarezm to me is the best of lands. May its rain-giving clouds never be blown away. It was the site of the throne of the sultans of the world. Its corners supported the shoulders of the great men of the age. Its mansions were resplendent with every kind of lofty idea, and its regions and districts were so many rose gardens. Such was the state of that country. The ruler of the new empire of Khwarezm was known as the Khwarezm Shah, and his name was Ala ad-Din Muhammad. He was a warrior and a conqueror, and proud of it. He had inherited a powerful kingdom from his father, and over the last 2 decades had expanded its borders even further into a true empire. Some in his court even flattered him that he was the new Alexander, that legends of his conquests would be told for centuries to come. This flattery made him bold, but also rash and impulsive. This proud Shah had agreed to receive the Mongol trade delegation, along with Genghis Khan's offer of friendship. As Djenghis recalls, the Genghis Khan sent a great number of offerings and said, "Say unto the Khwarezm Shah, I am the sovereign of the sunrise, and thou the sovereign of the sunset. Let there be between us a firm treaty of friendship and peace, and let traders and caravans on both sides come and go. But when the merchants arrived in the borderlands of Khwarezm, they ran into trouble. The first Khwarezmian town they arrived in was named Otrar. It sat in the middle of an oasis on the Sir Darya River, and as a crucial junction of several major roads. It was a quintessential Silk Road trading town. If you walked its streets during this time, they would have been heaving with merchant traffic, sounds of prayer from the mosques, vendors crying their wares, and the sounds of camels noisily watering after long days on the desert roads. But the governor of Otrar had a foolhardy nature. His name was Inalchuk, and he was an uncle of the Khwarezm Shah, the brother of the Shah's mother, and this gave him a great deal of power. The Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, had a complicated relationship with his mother, and she had amassed a great deal of influence at court. Some even whispered that she was the real power behind the throne, and so her brother Inalchuk may have believed he could do whatever he pleased. When he saw the Mongol caravan passing through his lands packed with gold and fine silks, Inalchuk hungered after their cargo. Some sources claim that he acted on the orders of the Shah himself, while others say that he acted alone. But we know that when the caravan passed through Otrar, Inalchuk accused the merchants of being spies. He ordered that they be arrested immediately, and their goods seized. In the struggle, the merchants were killed, and their gold and silks and other goods were taken to the great market town of Bukhara, where they were sold, and the governor Inalchuk of Otrar took his cut. He had just become a great deal richer, he might have thought. And what were a bunch of barbarian horsemen 3,000 kilometers away going to do about it? Automalik Yuvaini describes the magnitude of this man's mistake. In executing his command, he deprived these men of their lives and possessions. Nay, rather, he desolated and laid waste a whole world. For every drop of their blood, there would flow a whole river. In retribution for every hair on their heads, 100,000 heads would roll in the dust at every crossroad. In exchange for every dinar, 1,000 were exacted. Far away in the Mongol heartlands on the banks of the Anan River, a storm was brewing in the court of the Khan. Genghis Khan was naturally offended when he got word of the attack on his merchants, but he assumed there must have been some mistake. He sent an envoy of 3 ambassadors to seek an audience with the Khwarezm Shah and to ask for his uncle Inalchuk to be handed over for punishment. But the Khwarezm Shah, perhaps feeling his mother breathing down his neck, refused the Khan's demands, and to make matters worse he attempted what he must have hoped would look like a show of strength. When the Khan's ambassadors came before him, he had one of them killed on the spot. Then he rounded on the other 2. He ordered that their beards be shaved and that they be sent back to Mongolia with their humiliation, as an answer to the Khan. When these ambassadors returned to Mongolia with their faces shorn and the Shah's words on their lips, Genghis Khan's rage was seismic. Just as he had done before his invasion of China, he climbed to the top of the sacred mountain Burkan Khaldun, up through the broken stones and whispering pine needles, and there, with the Mongolian wind battering around him, asked the god of the great blue sky what he should do. The secret history records what answer he received. These tidings had such an effect upon the Khan's mind that the whirlwind of anger flared up with such a flame that it could be quenched only by the shedding of blood. In this fever, Genghis Khan went up alone to the summit of a hill, bared his head, turned his face towards the earth, and for 3 days and nights offered up prayer, saying, "I was not the author of this trouble. Grant me strength to exact vengeance." Thereupon he descended from the hill, meditating action and making ready for war. Chapter 7. The Khwarezmian Campaign begins. In the year 1219, Genghis Khan gathered a vast force of warriors. At perhaps as many as 200,000 men, it may have been twice the size of the force that had devastated Jin China. Along with his usual horde of nomadic horsemen, he brought powerful new units of Chinese siege engineers, experts at cracking open city walls, with a variety of ingenious engines. And with that horde, he marched west. Ahead of him was a journey of thousands of kilometers over deserts and mountains, but steadily the doom of the Khwarezmian Empire drew near. Juvaini describes the sight that the governor of Otrar saw arriving one day in December in a thunderous cataclysm outside his city walls. He bit the back of his hand in amazement at the unexpected sight. for he perceived that the plain had become a tossing sea of countless hosts and splendid troops, while the air was full of clamor and uproar, and the neighing of armored horses. The air became blue, the earth ebony, the sea boiled with the noise of the drums. With his fingers he pointed to the army on the plain, a host to which there was no end. The Khwarazm Shah had expected the arrival of the Mongol forces, but he had dramatically miscalculated the kind of response that Genghis Khan would give him. He himself commanded a force of perhaps 400,000 men, twice the size of the Mongol armies, and his cities were among the most fortified in the world. He was sure that if he shut up his armies in his great walled fortresses, the Mongols would soon run out of farms to burn and sheep herders to rob, and would eventually go home. But this would not turn out to be the case. The moment the Mongols arrived, their Chinese siege engineers began to build their engines. Otrar's defenses were formidable, but even these did not hold out for long. The Persian scholar Juzjani, a citizen of the Khwarezmian Empire who would flee to India after the Mongol invasion, writes about what happened next. In a short time, they took Otrar. They put both small and great, young and old, to the sword and left not a soul alive. They martyred the whole of them. The governor of Otrar, Inalchuk, was taken alive. To punish him for his greed in seizing the merchant's gold, Genghis Khan ordered that he be executed with a cruelly fitting punishment. He had a great quantity of silver melted down, reaching temperatures of nearly 1,000 degrees, and then poured the searing molten metal into the man's mouth, eyes, and ears. The city of Otrar was destroyed, and its people slaughtered, its remains a shattered sight rising from the arid plains in ragged heaps of fallen stone. But the rage of the Khan had only just begun. Otrar sat on the Sir Daria River, which formed the northernmost border of the Khwarezmian Empire. Several hundred kilometers to the south, another river, the Amu Darya, ran almost parallel to it, and on its banks stood the wealthiest cities of the region, the booming metropolis of Samarkand, and the scholarly religious heart of Bukhara. The 10th century Iranian author Istakhri, who traveled in the region, provides a vivid description of its pleasant landscape. I know no place in it or in Samarkand itself, where, if one ascends some elevated ground, one does not see greenery and a pleasant place. The land extends 8 days' travel through unbroken greenery and gardens along both sides of the river, and beyond these fields is pasture for flocks. Every town and settlement has a fortress. It is the most fruitful of all the countries of Allah. In it are the best trees and fruits. In every home are gardens, cisterns, and flowing water. It was on these cities that Genghis Khan now set his sights, but reaching these wealthy cities would be no easy feat. Between the Mongol armies and the walls of Samarkand and Bukhara lay more than 500 kilometers of sandy desert known as the Kizilkum, a name which means red sands in Turkic languages. This desert was baking hot, and even trade caravans would skirt around its edges rather than risk death in the wastes. The citizens of Bukhara and Samarkand had heard about the arrival of the Mongols in the north, but they were not particularly worried. Tribal nomads had raided along the northern riverlands before, but no large army could cross the Kizilkum Desert. But they had severely underestimated the Mongols. Genghis Khan left his 2 middle sons, Chagatai and Ogay, to finish up the siege of Otrar, with his eldest son Jochi taking an army north towards the Aral Sea. Meanwhile, he sent 2 small armies southward into the Fergana Valley, with instructions to hunt down and kill the Shah Muhammad. But Genghis Khan himself, accompanied by his youngest son Tolui, was determined to do what others had considered impossible, to cross the Kizilkum Desert with 30,000 horses and strike right at the heart of the empire, the religious center of Bukhara. The crossing would have been hard. Genghis Khan employed local men who knew the hidden paths through the wastes and the best time of year to make the journey. In the colder winter months, dew would sometimes form on the ground in certain places, and small plants could grow. With this help, the army successfully made the crossing and arrived on the other side on the 7th of February, 1220. Malik Shuvani describes the sight that the citizens of Bukhara saw outside their city walls. In the morning, Genghis Khan arrived unexpectedly before the town. When the inhabitants unaware beheld the surrounding countryside choked with horsemen, and the air black as night with a dust of cavalry, fright and panic overcame them, and fear and dread prevailed. His troops were more numerous than ants or locusts, being in their multitude beyond estimation or computation. Detachment after detachment arrived, each like a billowing sea, and encamped round about the town. At the sight of this force, the 20,000 or so soldiers stationed at Bukhara lost all hope of defending their city. When night fell, they attempted to flee under cover of darkness, but the Mongols spotted them and simply chased them down on the plains. By the light of the moon, the Mongol horsemen hunted and killed every single soldier, as though chasing deer on the steppe. The city of Bukhara surrendered within 3 days and opened its gates, with only a determined corps of soldiers holed up in its inner citadel. Intriguingly, it is in this moment that we have the only purported instance of Genghis Khan ever setting foot inside a city. Usually when it became clear that a settlement was about to fall to his soldiers, the Khan would leave one of his generals to loot the place, while he would return to his camp and his felt-walled tent, his job done. It is clear he had a powerful distaste for cities, and for anyone who would voluntarily imprison themselves within their walls and foul-smelling streets. But when Bukhara opened its great gate, the Persian sources describe him riding into its streets. Bukhara was one of the religious centers of the Muslim world at the time, and its reputation was known far and wide. But the Khan likely hated what he saw. We can imagine him wrinkling his nose at the pungent aromas of the medieval city, the rats scuttling through the sewers and fish markets and tanneries, the clouds of flies circling over rotting midden heaps and dung hills, all of it so different to the fresh open grasslands that he knew and loved. He went straight to the largest and grandest building, the great mosque of the city, which was famed across the Muslim world for its size and opulence. This he assumed must be the house of the king. As Malik Shuvani recounts, Genghis Khan asked those present whether this were the place of the Sultan. They replied that it was the house of God. Then he too got down from the horse, and mounting 2 or 3 steps of the pulpit he exclaimed, "The countryside is empty of food. Fill our horses' bellies." The Mongols brought the cases in which the Qurans were kept out into the courtyard of the mosque, where they cast the Qurans right and left, and turned the cases into mangers for their horses. Then Genghis Khan gathered the common people of the city in the great mosque of Bukhara, with the pages of the Quran still littering the floor. The people must have been terrified, shaking with fear, praying and weeping softly. Then over their heads the great Khan's voice rang out. He mounted the pulpit in the festival prayer space and said, "O people, know that you are great sinners, and your leaders are at the head of the pack in sin." You ask me why I say this? I say it because I am the scourge of God. If great sins had not been committed by you, the great God would not have sent you one like me as a torment. We do not know if this event truly took place as Shuvani describes. He was not old enough to witness it himself, but may have heard it secondhand. Or perhaps this episode was an invention of the writer, designed to make sense of what happened and explain the destruction of the Mongol invasion in terms that his Muslim readers could understand, as a judgment of God. But either way, we know what happened next. The citizens of Bukhara were rounded up and driven towards the citadel, where the Shah's forces were still resisting. Just as in China, the citizens were forced to dismantle their own city's defenses, and their bodies piled up below the walls. Against this onslaught, the citadel of Bukhara did not last long. Genghis Khan now wielded an army that combined the strength and mobility of the steppe warrior with the technological ingenuity of the Chinese. The combination was terrifying. As Shuvani describes, on the outside catapults were erected, bows bent and stones and arrows discharged, and on the inside ballistas and pots of naphtha were set in motion. It was like a red-hot furnace fed from without by hard sticks, while from the belly of the furnace sparks shot into the air. For days they fought in this manner. When the citadel finally fell, Genghis Khan ordered the city walls to be demolished utterly, and all the soldiers inside were slaughtered. But in return for their speedy surrender, the citizens of the wider city were spared. Giovanni recalls the simple proposition he offered to the Khwarezmian people. Let the emirs and great ones, and the numerous common people know this, that all the face of the earth, from the going up of the sun to his going down, I have given unto the Khan. Whosoever shall submit, mercy shall be shown to him, and to his wives and children and household. But whosoever shall not submit shall perish together with all his wives and children and kinsmen. This strategy of calculated leniency and brutality was ruthlessly effective, but it could only work if word got around. For this reason, Genghis Khan would always allow refugees to flood into other cities around the region, filling people's heads with stories of the vast destruction visited on all who opposed the Khan and his mercy to those who bent the knee. The Arab writer Ibn al-Athir, living in Mosul at the time, recounts the effect of these increasingly outlandish rumors. These Tartars, may God confound them, came from the east and wrought deeds which horrify all who hear of them. Stories have been related to me which the hearer can scarcely credit, as to the terror of the Tartars, which God Almighty cast into men's heart. This was one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in history, and the strategy paid off. With the siege of Bukhara completed, Genghis Khan now swung around and bore down on the wealthy metropolis of Samarkand. Samarkand was not just a booming trade hub. It was also a mighty fortress, and considered by many to be impregnable. It was defended by a large army, even including 20 war elephants brought from India. But at the sight of the Mongol force approaching, and with refugees in its streets spreading tales of terror, the army tasked with guarding its walls simply threw down their spears and surrendered. At the time of prayer, they opened the gate and closed the door of resistance. The Mongols then entered, and that day busied themselves with the destruction of the town and its defenses. The inhabitants drew their feet beneath the skirt of security, and the Mongols in no way molested them. The fall of Samarkand provided uncountable amounts of loot, and the Mongols now found themselves the new owners of some exotic novelties, the 20 Indian war elephants that the Shah had used in his army. But Genghis Khan had little use for these beasts. The elephant handlers brought their elephants to Genghis Khan and demanded elephant food. He asked them what the elephants had lived on before they fell into captivity. They replied, the grass of the plains. When he heard this, he ordered the elephants be set free to forage for themselves. They were accordingly released, and in the end perished of hunger. In return for surrendering, the citizens of Samarkand were spared a massacre. But in other places that surrendered, the Mongols' restraint was misinterpreted as weakness. This was when things could get ugly. One such example was the Khwarezmian city of Nishapur. Nishapur was the largest metropolitan city on the Silk Road, a vast and wealthy place in what is today northeastern Iran. It sat in a fertile plain at the foot of the Bainalud mountain range, in a region known as Khorasan. Giovanni describes its beauty. If the earth may be compared to the heavens, then the lands are like its stars, and Nishapur among these stars is like the fair Venus of the skies. What are men doing in Baghdad and Kufa, seeing that Nishapur is upon the earth? For if there be a paradise on the face of the earth, it is this, and if it is not a paradise, then there is no paradise at all. The Mongols arrived at Nishapur in 1221, and at first the city took the Khan's deal. It opened its gates and its treasuries to the Mongols. But then the Mongol army departed with their riches, and left behind only a handful of governors to keep their hold on the city. The citizens of Nishapur took this withdrawal as a sign that the Mongols did not intend to hold it. They soon revolted, killed the small number of Mongol governors, and locked their gates. When they got word of this, the Khan's army swung back around and laid siege to the city. Still, its fate was not entirely sealed. That was until a single arrow flew down from the city walls and struck one of the Mongol attackers, killing him. Unfortunately, for the people of Nishapur, he was the husband of one of Genghis Khan's daughters, the great Khan's son-in-law, a man named Tokachar. Until the third day, they fought fiercely from the tower of Korakwash and discharged quarrels and arrows from the walls and ramparts. By an evil chance which was to be the bane of all that people, an arrow was let fly whereby Tokachar fell lifeless. The townsmen, having made an end of him, without recognizing his person. The death of a member of the Mongol royal bloodline was something that Genghis Khan took extremely seriously. When the city finally fell, he called upon his widowed daughter and told her that she would be allowed to decide the fate of Nishapur. In her grief and rage, he ordered that the city be utterly destroyed and every living thing within its walls put to death. They then drove all the survivors, men and women, out onto the plain, and in order to avenge Tokachar, it was commanded that the town should be laid waste, in such a manner that the site could be plowed upon, and that in the exaction of vengeance not even cats and dogs would be left alive. The destruction of the city was total, and the vengeance of the Khan remorseless in its totality. They severed the heads of the slain from their bodies, and heaped them up in piles, keeping those of the men separate from those of the women and children. Abodes and dwelling places were leveled with the dust. Rose gardens became furnaces. After the fall of the empire's most powerful fortress of Samarkand, the Khwarezmian Shah truly began to panic. As his cities fell one by one, the Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad turned tail and fled. He rode from fortress to fortress as the Mongol armies pursued him, and as he did, he slipped into a deep depression. Yuvani recounts that he began to be plagued with nightmares. He began drinking heavily and spent all his time in the pursuit of pleasures. The terror of the last day was apparent in his condition, and fear and dread were manifest in his speech. For the remainder of his life, he constantly applied himself to the quaffing of cups of purple wine. One night in his sleep, the Sultan saw luminous persons, their faces scratched, their hair disordered and disheveled, clad in black robes like mourners, who smote their heads and made lamentation. He asked them who they were, and they replied, "We are Islam." Eventually, with his nightmares and the Mongol horsemen chasing close behind him, the Shah escaped to the most remote hideout he could manage. He took a boat out onto a small island off the coast of the Caspian Sea and hid there. Whenever he halted for a day, the Mongols would overtake him. The Sultan sent for certain emirs and consulted them. They thought it best for him to seek asylum in one of the islands of the Sea of Abaskan. He went to one of these islands, where he remained for a while. Then, when the report of his presence on the island was spread about, he took the precaution of removing to another island. Finally, the Mongols captured the Shah's capital of Gurganj, and his family fell into the hands of Djenghis Khan. When the dreadful news reached the Sultan, and he learned that his small sons had been put to the sword, that his veiled womenfolk had been in the clutches of strangers, and that all of his wedded wives had fallen into the embraces of other men, his head grew dizzy. The world grew dark before his eyes. Then was the pain past remedy, and threatened his very existence, and he preferred death to life. He writhed in this anguish and agitation, and bemoaned this calamity and disaster, until he delivered up his soul to God, and was released from the sorrow of his life and the trickery of the revolving heavens. Alone on his tiny island, the Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, died, possibly of dysentery, in the year 1220. He was buried, wrapped in a torn white shirt for a shroud. His empire, now utterly destroyed, passed into the hands of the Mongols. His eldest son, an accomplished warrior named Jalal ad-Din, evaded capture and led a sizable force south in the direction of India, where he intended to continue his resistance. But he was finally caught by the pursuing Mongol force in the autumn of 1221, and his army was utterly destroyed. Legend has it that Jalal ad-Din only escaped death by leaping his horse into the Indus River and swimming for safety across the rushing torrent of its waters. The geographer Yaqut al-Hamawi, a citizen of the city of Merv, who fled the advance of the Mongols, wrote about the destruction they left in their wake. Those infidels and heathens roamed through those abodes, so that palaces were erased off the earth, as lines of writing are effaced from paper, and cities became a dwelling for the owl and the raven. In those places the screech owls answer each other. They are filled with sadness. The devil himself would bewail the great catastrophe. It was an event enough to turn gray the hair of children. The Arab writer Ibn al-Athir also wrote with palpable sorrow about the horror of those days. With one stroke, a world which billowed with fertility, was laid desolate, and the regions thereof became a desert, and the greater part of the living dead, and their skin and bones crumbling dust, and the mighty were humbled. For some years I continued averse from mentioning this event, deeming it so horrible that I shrank from recording it. Oh, would that my mother had not borne me, or that I had died and become a forgotten thing before this befell. Nay, it is unlikely that mankind will see the like of this calamity until the world comes to an end and perishes. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire had taken 4 years. It had wiped some of the world's largest cities off the map and cost countless lives, and by the end of it, Genghis Khan's empire was the largest that the world had ever seen. Chapter 8. The Taoist Monk and the Question of Immortality. By this time, Genghis Khan was in his 60s, and he was beginning to think with increasing trepidation about his own mortality. During his campaign in Persia, he invited a Chinese Taoist monk named Master Chang Chun to visit him in the hopes that this wise man might have some answer about how a man could live forever. This holy man's journey is recorded in a text called The Account of the Perfect Master Chang Chun's Journey to the West. In it he describes his journey over the Mongolian steppe. On the 5th day of the 3rd month, we began traveling in a northeasterly direction. All around us we saw human habitation, nothing but black carts and white tents and herders following the grass and water to pasture their animals. When we passed out of the marshy plains, there was not even the smallest tree or shrub. Only yellow dust clouds and white grasses were in sight. On his journey he saw everywhere the signs of the great war that was unfolding, and passed by a number of battlefields left by the passage of the Mongol armies into the west. The stony gorge on the south was unbearably alarming. On both sides precipices held up the towering sky, and the chilly surge of a mountain stream flowed and rolled over the ground. People covered their noses because of corpses strewn about the narrow path, but it was the long-eared donkeys drowned in the stream that sickened my heart. War has raged for 10 years and over huge distances. When he finally arrived in Samarkand, after months of travel, he found the city half empty. Many of its inhabitants fled, and its walls and defenses torn down. In the 2nd month of winter, on the 18th day, we crossed a large river and reached north of the city of Samarkand. Before the Sultan was defeated, there were more than 100,000 households in the city. Since the fall of the city, only 1 in 4 remains. Finally, he reached the court of the great Khan. When he arrived, Genghis Khan had one question on his mind. Refreshments and drinks were served, and then the emperor asked, "Now that you have come all this way, what secret elixir for long life can you provide me?" But the Taoist master would disappoint him. The master replied, "There is the way of good health, but I can give you no elixir for long life." His Majesty appreciated the master's candor and ordered 2 tents to be erected to the east of his residence in which we would stay. It is clear from this that Genghis Khan was beginning to fear that he did not have long left. A hunting accident also seems to have frightened him and brought the question of his mortality to the forefront of his mind. On the 8th day, the emperor went hunting in the foothills of the eastern mountains and shot at a large boar. His horse tripped, and he lost control. The boar stood nearby, not daring to advance until his entourage rushed in with another horse. The hunt was called off, and the emperor returned. When the master heard about the incident, he went to remonstrate with the emperor, saying, "Your falling from your horse is a warning from heaven." The emperor responded, saying, "I've already come to this deep realization." For 2 months thereafter, he did not go out to hunt. The man who had brought so much death to other lands now felt its icy hand on his own shoulder. Genghis Khan's concern was not just for his own life. Now in his 60s he began to realize too late that he had not sufficiently prepared for the inevitable question of his succession. He would pass on to his heirs the largest land empire that history would ever know. But when he looked at his 4 sons by his chief Empress Borte, he found them totally unprepared to take on such a burden. It is likely that his plan was a simple one. His empire would be divided into a kaleidoscope of different provinces, and over these 3 of his sons would rule. But he would ensure that each held possessions in the other's lands, so that none would be tempted to go to war. Above these three brothers would sit the fourth son, who would rule the entire empire in his place as the Great Khan. The system was well conceived, but it would depend on the cooperation of every one of his sons, and for a number of reasons, that is the one thing that Genghis Khan did not have. He had brought his four sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogedai, and Tolui, with him on the Khwarezmian campaign, and they had each led armies and fought bravely, but throughout the war trouble had been brewing. Just as he and his half-brother Bektar had once quarreled over fish and rabbits, now his sons fought over cities and kingdoms. First, let us take a look at the character of each of his sons. The eldest of Genghis Khan's sons was Jochi, but his life had been lived under a cloud of suspicion. He was the son whose name meant guest, as though he was simply a visitor who was being shown courtesy by the rest of the family. He had been born shortly after Genghis Khan's wife, Borte, was kidnapped by the Merkit Forest people, and no one could know for sure whether Genghis Khan was truly his father. Still, the Khan had all his life treated Jochi as one of his sons, and Jochi also had the strongest desire to prove himself. He was a courageous leader who always charged right into the heart of the fight. Whatever the truth of his fatherhood, he had spent his life living up to the reputation of his father. But while Genghis Khan seems to have set the issue of his parenthood aside, his other sons could not forget it so readily. Next in line was Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai. Chagatai was hot-headed and proud, and all his life had resented his older brother Jochi. When Genghis Khan looked at Jochi and Chagatai, it is hard to imagine that he did not see the similarity between himself and his older brother, Bektar, and remember, perhaps now with a little sadness, how that story had ended with Bektar lying dead in the long grass of the steppe. All his life Chagatai had felt sure that Jochi was not his father's son, and he treated his older brother with contempt. Silently, he feared that the throne of the Great Khan would be given to his older brother, in his eyes a usurper and the son of the Merkit who raped his mother. In hope of mending the relationship between these two brothers, Genghis Khan had given them a joint mission in the last war to capture the Khwarezmian Shah's capital of Gurgenj, but the plan had been a disaster. The defenders of the city put up a fearsome resistance that lasted 6 months, and the brothers were forced to burn it down in order to push them back. Since the city would belong to Jochi once it was captured, Chagatai cared little about how much damage was done to it, whereas Jochi wished to protect its buildings even at the cost of Mongol lives. Genghis Khan had hoped to capture the jewel of this empire intact, but now Gurgenj was a ruin, and the city would never regain its former splendor. This episode seems to have been just another point of bitter contention between the two brothers and a warning about the burning resentments smoldering between them. The third brother was named Ogedai. He was charismatic and larger than life, a barrel-chested man with an unusually large beard for a Mongol. He had a jovial personality and a love of feasting and drinking. He was a capable general, but he did have one overriding weakness. That was his raging alcoholism. Like many Mongols, Ogedai was a big drinker, but even by Mongol standards, his habit went too far. At one point, his older brother Chagatai had appointed an official to monitor Ogedai's drinking, but it was no good. Ogedai evaded his watcher and drank himself silly regardless. One common story about him describes how he promised his brothers that he would halve the number of cups he drank every night, but he simply ordered a new cup to be made that was twice the size, and so his drinking went on. Still, Ogedai was diplomatic and generous, and as a result, was well liked by all. The final brother was Tolui. He was the youngest of the four, a calculating and formidable warrior, and he had a famed streak of cruelty. During the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, he had been sent to pacify the region of Khorasan, and passed through the region dealing out death on a scale that was unusual, even for Mongols. He had been leading the army responsible for the massacre at Nishapur, and he repeated the same genocidal violence at the great cities of Merv and Herat. At these settlements he promised the inhabitants that he would spare them if they surrendered. But unlike his father, he went back on his word. When they opened the gates, he ordered that every living person be put to the sword. Interestingly, Mongol tradition often held that the youngest son should inherit his father's property as a kind of social welfare. It was assumed that by the time their father died, the older brothers would have already amassed their own wealth, whereas the youngest had the most need of an inheritance. This rule had never been applied to titles which were supposed to be appointed to the most worthy candidate. But it must have been playing on everyone's minds, as the question of the Khan's succession became ever more pressing. It was these 4 sons that Genghis Khan summoned to a fateful Kuriltai, a meeting of the clans in 1223, at a region called Kolanbashi in modern Kazakhstan. Yochi, the man of uncertain fatherhood, Chagatai, the hot-headed and embittered would-be older brother, Ogde, the stocky wine-soaked drinker, and Toli, the cold-hearted warrior. In the smoke-filled atmosphere of his great tent, he told them that there they would decide who would rule the empire after he was gone. The secret history records that one of his wives, Yessui, urged him to choose his successor in the following words: "Living beings who are born to this world are not eternal. When your body like a great old tree will fall down, to whom will you give your people, which is like tangled hemp? When your body like the stone base of a pillar will collapse, to whom will you bequeath your people, which is like a flock of birds? Of your 4 sons, the heroes whom you have begotten, which one will you designate as your successor?" But the Kuriltai got off to a bad start. First, Genghis Khan asked his oldest son Jochi to speak, and this sign of apparent favor enraged his hot-headed younger brother, Chagatai. He said, "The eldest of my sons is Jochi. What do you, Jochi, say? Speak up." But before Jochi could utter a sound, Chagatai said, "Do you mean that you will appoint Jochi as your successor? How can we let ourselves be ruled by this bastard son of a merchant?" The effect of this pronouncement was explosive. At these words, Jochi rose and, grabbing Chagatai by the collar, said, "I have never been told by my father the Khan that I was different from my brothers. How can you discriminate against me? In what skill are you better than I? Only in your pig-headedness could you possibly exceed me." Genghis Khan watched his sons fighting in silence. Seeing the flames of the hearth fire dance in their eyes, perhaps he remembered the words of his mother Elun on the day that he and Khazar had killed their brother Bektar. Suddenly, his great voice boomed out, trembling with anger. "Before you were born, the starry sky was turning upon itself. The many people of the felt tents were in turmoil. They fought against each other. At such time your mother was abducted. It was not her wish. It happened at a time when one man slew another. She was not in love with someone else. You speak so as to harden the butter of your mother's affection, so as to sour the milk of that lady's heart. Were you two not born from the same belly? Were you two not issued from a single womb?" These were almost the same words that his mother Elun had once used on him, the same words that the legendary Alan the Beautiful had said to her quarreling sons. The brothers were chastened, and perhaps realizing that they had harmed both of their own chances, Chagatai suggested another candidate that everyone could agree on. "I shall not dispute Jochi's strength, nor shall I reply to his claims of skill. But it is Ogedai among us who is steady and reliable. Let us therefore agree on Ogedai." So he spoke, and at these words Genghis Khan said, "What do you say, Jochi? Speak up." Whereupon Jochi said, "Chagatai has just said it. Chagatai and I shall, in cooperation with each other, serve the Khandai. Let us agree on Ogedai. From this moment on, the drunken but charismatic Ogedai would be the heir to the Mongol Empire." After that explosive meeting, the brothers rode off in all directions, never to be reunited. The oldest son, Jochi, was most wounded by Genghis Khan's decision and would never see his father again. Wearied by this conflict in his family, the great Khan set out back to Mongolia, arriving there in spring of 1225. Perhaps those who saw him there felt a change come over him. The life of the great Khan was coming to an end. Chapter 9. The Final Campaign and the Death of Genghis Khan. In the year 1225, Genghis Khan set out on what would be his final military campaign. It would be against the Tanguts of western Kayseri, the Tibetan Buddhists he had already conquered on his way to northern China. In the years since they had become unreliable allies and were beginning to rebel against his rule. With the Khwarezmian Empire conquered, he now wanted to punish the Tanguts for their impudence. He marched into their lands and laid waste to them. But on this campaign, while traveling through the hot deserts of the western regions, Genghis Khan fell from his horse. As the secret history records, Genghis Khan, riding his steed named Red Earth Grey, on the way hunted the many wild asses of Arbukadar. When the wild asses passed close by them, his horse took fright. Genghis Khan fell, and his body being in great pain, he halted at Cho-Orkot. He spent that night there, and the following morning his wife Yisui Khatun said, "Princes and commanders, consult each other on what to do. The Khan has spent the night his body hot with fever." The summer heat made the Khan's condition worse, and so his men took him up into the nearby mountains of Lupan, densely forested with Chinese pine and dragon spruce just beginning to turn to their autumn colors. Not long after, the great Khan's illness worsened, and he died at the end of August in the year 1227. The secret history of the Mongols records his passing in brief terms. Genghis Khan came back and in the year of the pig ascended to heaven. There is much debate over what exactly killed Genghis Khan. There are several outlandish myths that circulate around the circumstances of his death. Some more colorful versions fill his passing with dramatic irony, imagining a Tangut princess killing and castrating him when he tries to force her into bed. But most chronicles simply mention an illness that fell on him suddenly. Among them, the Persian historian Atta Malik Juvaini records, when Genghis Khan returned from the lands of the west to his old incumbent in the east, he was overcome by an incurable disease arising from the unpleasantness of the climate. Some modern scholars have even suggested that he was an early casualty of the bubonic plague, which would soon spread westwards across Eurasia and cause death and destruction on an unprecedented scale. The Chinese language source The History of Yuan, or Yuan Shi, records that on the 18th of August, the Khan felt unwell with a fever, and 8 days later, he died. Such a rapid pace of decline could point to the Black Death being the cause. Whatever the cause of his death, the Khan's body was soon prepared for burial. Mongols of this time held a great taboo around speaking about death, and so we actually know little about the deaths of many of the characters in this story. Some, like Genghis Khan's wife, Borte, simply disappear from records altogether, and we have no information about when or how she died. As for the Khan, some believe that he was probably buried close to where his army was situated, somewhere in Ningxia among the Lupan Mountains. But other sources record a more dramatic version of events. The Venetian explorer Marco Polo, who traveled to Mongolia nearly half a century later, wrote the following account that was told to him. All the Grand Khans and all the descendants of Genghis, their first lord, are carried to a mountain to be interred. Wherever so, the sovereign may die, he is carried to his burial in that mountain with his predecessors. No matter if the place of his death were 100 days' journey distant, there must he be carried to his burial. Mongol religious beliefs held that the bodies of the dead should never be disturbed. For this reason, Marco Polo also recounts that the Mongols were determined that no one should ever find the grave of the great Khan, that his body would forever lie undisturbed, and that they went to extraordinary lengths to make sure its location remained a secret. When they are carrying the body of any emperor to be buried with the others, the convoy that goes with the body puts to the sword all whom they fall in with on the road. They do the same too with horses. For when the emperor dies, they kill all his best horses in order that he may have the use of them in the other world, as they believe. And I tell you as a certain truth, that when one Khan died, more than 20,000 persons who chanced to meet the body on its way were slain in the manner I have told. While these accounts may be an exaggeration, what is sure is that the Mongol soldiers fenced off a large area of land around the sacred mountain, Birken Kaldon, marking it with a fence of arrows stuck in the ground. Other than the closest royal family of the Khan, no one was allowed to enter this forbidden zone on pain of death, with guards permanently stationed on its perimeter. The later Mongol historian Sagang II describes the body of Genghis Khan being removed to his native Mongolia on a two-wheeled wagon escorted by his great army. On the way, one of the Khan's old friends began to sing a mournful song. Kalukan Bahadur of the Sunid tribe lifted up his voice and sang, "Once you did swoop like a falcon, but now a rumbling wagon trundles you off. O my king, have you in truth then forsaken your wife and your children, and the rule of your people? O my king, circling in pride like an eagle once you did lead us. O my king, but now you have stumbled and fallen like a wild horse. O my king, today it is thought that the most likely place for the Khan's burial is in this area, somewhere around the mountain of Burkan Khaldun, the holy peak that he had always climbed whenever he needed to hear the voice of his god and to be close to the great sky above. Now, between Genghis Khan and the great blue sky, there was only silence. After the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongol army completed the conquest of Western Asia. The royal family was executed, and the population was severely punished for their failure to support the Mongols during the Khwarezmian campaign. Genghis Khan had ordered this destruction before his death, and his generals carried out his wishes. The Western Asia state ceased to exist. The empire itself faced a critical test. Would it hold together, or would the succession dispute tear it apart? For several years there was an interregnum. Temüjin, as the youngest son, served as regent administering the Mongol heartland, while the question of succession was debated. The Mongol nobility, the Noyons, and Genghis Khan's family held a Kuriltai, a great assembly, to formally elect the new great Khan. As Genghis Khan had wished, Ogday was chosen, but there had been tensions. Yochi had died shortly before his father, possibly from illness, though some later sources hint at assassination, removing one potential claimant. Chagatai and Temüjin both ultimately supported Ogday, honoring their father's wishes. But the seeds of future conflicts were sown. The Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Il Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty would eventually emerge as semi-independent realms, each ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's family. But for now, in 1229, when Ogday was formally enthroned as the second great Khan, the empire remained unified, and it would continue to expand. Under Ogday, the conquest of the Jin dynasty was completed in 1234. Under Genghis Khan's grandson Mongke and great-grandson Kublai, the Mongols would conquer the Song dynasty and all of China by 1279. Other Mongol armies would sweep through Russia and Eastern Europe, reaching Hungary and Poland. The Mongols would conquer Persia, Mesopotamia, and even attack the Abbasid Caliphate, sacking Baghdad in 1258. The Mongol Empire would reach its greatest extent under Kublai Khan around 1279, encompassing an area of approximately 9 million square miles, roughly 16% of the Earth's land surface. It would be the largest contiguous land empire ever created, dwarfing Rome, Alexander's conquests, and all others. All of this rested on foundations laid by Genghis Khan. The military organization, the administrative systems, the laws, the strategy of conquest, all bore his imprint. His descendants would build on what he had created, but the vision was his. Chapter 10. Legacy and the Long Shadow. Yet Genghis Khan's legacy is complex and contested. He was without question one of history's great conquerors and state builders. But he was also responsible for destruction on a massive scale. How should we remember him? What is his ultimate place in history? To answer these questions, we must examine his long-term legacy and impact on world history. Genghis Khan died nearly 800 years ago, yet his shadow still falls across world history. No single individual has had a more direct impact on the geography of power, the flow of trade and ideas, and the ethnic and cultural composition of Eurasia. To understand his legacy, we must look at multiple dimensions: military, political, economic, cultural, and even genetic. Let us begin with the military legacy. Genghis Khan revolutionized warfare in ways that influenced military thinking for centuries. The Mongol military system, combining mobility, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and sophisticated tactics became a model studied by generals for generations. The decimal organization, the emphasis on merit over birth, the integration of conquered peoples and their technologies. These innovations persist in various forms in modern military organizations. The Mongols demonstrated that cavalry, when properly organized and led, could defeat any contemporary force. They showed that speed and maneuverability could overcome numerical disadvantages. They pioneered combined arms tactics, integrating cavalry, infantry, and siege engineers into coordinated operations. They used intelligence systematically, understanding that information was as important as numbers or courage. The psychological dimension of Mongol warfare, the calculated use of terror to induce surrender, was brutally effective, but morally troubling. The Mongols understood that their reputation often did their fighting for them. Cities that heard about Mongol atrocities elsewhere would surrender without resistance. In a grim calculus, this actually reduced total casualties. A city that surrendered immediately was spared. A city that resisted was annihilated, but its destruction convinced 10 other cities to surrender. The Mongols weaponized fear itself. This approach raises profound ethical questions that resonate today. Is it justifiable to commit atrocities against some if it prevents greater bloodshed overall? Where is the line between military necessity and war crimes? These questions have no simple answers, but they are part of Genghis Khan's legacy. The political legacy is equally significant. The Mongol Empire at its height created a unified political space stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. Never before had so much of the world been under a single political authority. This unification had profound effects. First, it ended centuries of regional conflicts and power struggles. The constant warfare between Chinese dynasties, Central Asian Khanates, Persian sultanates, and Russian principalities was replaced by Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace. This peace was enforced through violence and the threat of violence. But once established, it brought stability to vast regions that had known little but conflict. Second, the Mongol Empire created the first truly Eurasian political system. Previous empires, Rome, Han China, the Islamic caliphates, had been large, but they were regional. The Mongol Empire spanned the entire breadth of Eurasia, linking east and west in unprecedented ways. This created a political framework within which ideas, technologies, and peoples could move freely across vast distances. Third, the Mongol approach to governance, combining local autonomy with overarching imperial authority, promoting meritocracy, and practicing religious tolerance, offered an alternative to the more rigid political systems of the time. The Mongols showed that a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire could function effectively. This model would influence later empires from the Ottomans to the Mughals. The economic legacy may be the most transformative aspect of Genghis Khan's empire. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road experienced its greatest period of prosperity. For the first time in history, merchants could travel from the Mediterranean to the Pacific with reasonable security, protected by Mongol law and the Yam postal system. This facilitated an explosion of trade. Silk, porcelain, and tea from China flowed west. Gold, silver, and precious stones from Central Asia moved in all directions. Spices from Southeast Asia reached European markets. Persian carpets and metalwork traveled east. The volume of trade increased dramatically, enriching merchants, generating tax revenue for Mongol rulers, and exposing different cultures to each other's goods. But trade carried more than goods. Ideas traveled the Silk Road as well. Chinese printing technology spread westward, eventually reaching Europe and contributing to the Renaissance. Islamic mathematics and astronomy moved eastward, enriching Chinese science. Agricultural techniques were exchanged. Chinese rice cultivation spread to Persia, while Persian irrigation methods influenced Chinese agriculture. Medical knowledge circulated with physicians from different traditions, learning from each other. Technologies crossed continents. Gunpowder, invented in China, spread westward under Mongol rule and would eventually transform European warfare. The compass and other navigational tools moved along the trade routes. Artistic styles blended. Persian miniature painting influenced Chinese art, while Chinese motifs appeared in Persian and Islamic decorative arts. The cultural cross-pollination of the Mongol period laid groundwork for the global interconnection that would accelerate in later centuries. However, trade also carried something deadly: disease. The Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, likely traveled westward along the Silk Road from Central Asia. The unified Mongol Empire, with its extensive trade networks and rapid communications, inadvertently created a disease highway. Plague-infected fleas on rats traveled in merchant caravans and Mongol military camps, spreading from China through Central Asia to the Black Sea, and from there to Europe via Italian merchant ships. The plague devastated Europe between 1347 and 1353, fundamentally altering European society. Labor shortages led to the breakdown of feudalism, rising wages for peasants, and social unrest. The plague shook the authority of the Catholic Church and may have contributed to the Protestant Reformation. In a grim irony, the same Mongol peace that facilitated the Renaissance and global trade also enabled one of history's worst pandemics. This is part of Genghis Khan's complex legacy. His empire connected the world with all the benefits and dangers that entailed. The cultural legacy of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire is profound, though often underappreciated. The Mongols' policy of religious tolerance was remarkable for its time and stood in stark contrast to the religious conflicts consuming much of the world. In Mongol-ruled territories, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, and practitioners of various indigenous religions coexisted with less friction than in most contemporary societies. This tolerance had practical roots. The Mongols needed to govern diverse populations and could not afford to alienate any major religious community, but it also reflected genuine Mongol attitudes. Traditional Mongol spirituality was pluralistic, recognizing different paths to understanding the divine. Genghis Khan and his successors employed advisors and officials from all religious backgrounds, promoting them based on ability rather than faith. The Mongol capital of Karakorum, built under Ogedei Khan, exemplified this cosmopolitanism. The city hosted Christian churches, Muslim mosques, Buddhist temples, and traditional Mongol shrines, all within walking distance of each other. Religious leaders of different faiths debated theology at the Khan's court, with the Khan acting as interested observer, rather than enforcing any particular orthodoxy. This pluralistic environment was centuries ahead of its time. The Mongol Empire also preserved and transmitted classical knowledge. When the Mongols conquered Baghdad in 1258, they destroyed much of that city's famous libraries, a cultural catastrophe. But they also employed Persian and Arab scholars, who preserved many classical texts and continued scientific and philosophical work under Mongol patronage. The observatory at Maraga in Persia, established under Mongol rule, made significant astronomical observations and trained scholars who would influence later Islamic and European astronomy. In China, the Mongol Yuan dynasty encouraged foreign contact and cultural exchange to an unprecedented degree. Foreigners, Marco Polo being the most famous example, served in the Mongol administration. Christian missionaries from Europe traveled to China and established churches. Persian and Central Asian influences enriched Chinese culture. The Yuan period, though often viewed as foreign occupation by Chinese historians, was actually a time of significant cultural activity and artistic achievement. Now we must address a controversial aspect of Genghis Khan's legacy: genetics. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a study suggesting that approximately 16 million men living today, roughly 0.5% of the world's male population, carry a Y chromosome lineage that traces back to a single individual who lived in Mongolia around 1,000 years ago. The researchers hypothesized that this individual was likely Genghis Khan or one of his close male relatives. This finding, if accurate, suggests an extraordinary biological legacy. Genghis Khan had numerous wives and concubines, as was standard for Mongol nobility. His sons and grandsons similarly had large families. Through centuries of genealogical proliferation, their genetic lineage spread across Asia. The genes of Genghis Khan's family may flow in the veins of millions of people today, from Mongolia to Central Asia to parts of Russia and China. However, geneticists caution that this hypothesis, while intriguing, remains unproven. We cannot test it definitively without genetic material from Genghis Khan himself. And since his burial site remains undiscovered, we have no such sample. The genetic signature could belong to one of his ancestors or descendants, rather than Genghis Khan himself. Nevertheless, the study highlights the extraordinary demographic impact of the Mongol conquests and the biological legacy of the Borjigin clan. The historiographical legacy, how Genghis Khan has been remembered and portrayed, is complex and often contradictory. In the Islamic world, he was long remembered as a destroyer, a catastrophe sent by God to punish the faithful. Persian and Arab historians wrote of the Mongol invasions with horror, describing cities erased and populations slaughtered. The fall of Baghdad, where the Mongols killed the caliph and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, was seen as a civilizational trauma. In China, the Mongol period was often portrayed negatively by later historians, especially after the Ming dynasty overthrew Mongol rule in 1368. The Mongols were seen as foreign oppressors, barbarians who had conquered the civilized Chinese through brute force. The Yuan dynasty is acknowledged as a legitimate Chinese dynasty, but with ambivalence. In Europe, Genghis Khan and the Mongols were portrayed as the ultimate barbarians, savage hordes threatening Christian civilization. Medieval European chronicles described the Mongols in apocalyptic terms, sometimes suggesting they were the armies of Gog and Magog, biblical harbingers of the end times. This image of Mongols as destructive, uncivilized barbarians persisted in Western imagination for centuries. But in Mongolia, Genghis Khan is a national hero, revered as the founder of the Mongol nation. His face appears on currency, buildings, and monuments. His birthday is a national holiday. He is seen as the unifier who brought the Mongol tribes together and established Mongolia as a major world power. For modern Mongolians, Genghis Khan is a source of pride and national identity. In recent decades, historical understanding of Genghis Khan has become more nuanced. Scholars like Jack Weatherford have argued that Genghis Khan was not simply a destroyer, but also a builder and innovator. His legal reforms, religious tolerance, promotion of trade, and meritocratic approach to governance were progressive for his time. The Mongol Empire, while certainly built through violence, also facilitated unprecedented cultural exchange and global connectivity. This revisionist view does not excuse or minimize the atrocities committed by Mongol armies. Cities were destroyed, millions died, and entire civilizations were traumatized by the Mongol conquests. These are historical facts that cannot and should not be denied. But a complete understanding of Genghis Khan must acknowledge both the destruction and the construction, both the violence and the institutions, both the terror and the tolerance. Genghis Khan operated in a brutal age when warfare was endemic and mercy was often seen as weakness. By the standards of his own time, his actions were not uniquely cruel. Alexander the Great massacred entire cities. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul resulted in perhaps 1 million deaths. The Crusades involved systematic massacres of civilians. Medieval European warfare regularly included atrocities. What distinguished Genghis Khan was not the nature of his violence, but its scale and effectiveness. Yet Genghis Khan also created something unprecedented, a unified empire stretching across Eurasia, governed by consistent laws, promoting trade and cultural exchange, and practicing religious tolerance. He rose from nothing, an orphaned enslaved boy, to become the most powerful man on earth through intelligence, determination, and leadership. His life story is extraordinary by any measure. Perhaps the most important aspect of Genghis Khan's legacy is how he demonstrated the world-changing potential of effective leadership and organization. He took the Mongol tribes, poor, divided, and seemingly insignificant, and forged them into the dominant power of their age. He showed that with the right combination of military innovation, political strategy, and administrative skill, Even a numerically inferior force from a peripheral region could reshape the world. This lesson has been learned and relearned throughout history. Small groups with superior organization, discipline, and strategy have repeatedly defeated larger but less organized forces. The Mongols under Genghis Khan are perhaps the ultimate example of this principle. Genghis Khan's impact on world history is difficult to overstate. He created the largest contiguous empire ever known. He facilitated global trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. He influenced military strategy and tactics for centuries. His policies of religious tolerance and meritocracy were progressive. His legal code and administrative systems provided frameworks for governance across vast territories. Yet he was also responsible for destruction on a massive scale. Millions died in the Mongol conquests. Great cities were razed. Civilizations were traumatized. The moral balance sheet is complex and perhaps impossible to calculate. What can we say with certainty? That Genghis Khan changed the world. That his actions for better and worse shaped the course of history. That his life story from outcast to world conqueror is one of the most extraordinary in human history. And that 8 centuries after his death, we are still grappling with his legacy. Conclusion. The Man and the Mountain. We began this journey on the windswept steppes of Mongolia in 1162 with the birth of a boy named Temüjin, clutching a blood clot in his fist. We ended in 1227 with the death of Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, whose empire stretched from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. Between those two moments lies a story of almost impossible transformation. The boy who was orphaned and enslaved, who survived on marmots and wild roots, who was hunted and nearly killed by his own people. That boy became the most powerful man on earth. He conquered more territory than Alexander, Caesar, or Napoleon. He ruled more people than any contemporary monarch. He changed the world in ways that still resonate today. How did he do it? The answer is complex, involving personal qualities, historical circumstances, and no small measure of luck. But certain factors stand out. First, Genghis Khan was a strategic genius. He thought several moves ahead, anticipating his enemy's actions and preparing accordingly. He understood the importance of intelligence gathering, of knowing his enemies better than they knew themselves. He was flexible, adapting tactics to circumstances rather than rigidly following tradition. Second, he was a master of human psychology. He understood how to inspire loyalty in his followers through generosity and protection. He understood how to terrorize his enemies into surrender. He knew when to be merciful and when to be ruthless, using both as tools of policy. Third, he was an organizational genius. He created military and administrative systems that were more efficient than anything his enemies could field. The decimal organization of his army, the Yam postal system, the legal code of the Yassa, these were innovations that gave the Mongols crucial advantages. Fourth, he was a learner. Despite being illiterate, he recognized the value of knowledge and expertise. He employed Chinese engineers, Persian administrators, and scholars from various backgrounds. He adopted useful technologies and practices from conquered peoples. He was not constrained by tradition or prejudice if something worked better. Fifth, he was extraordinarily resilient. Time and again, he faced setbacks and defeats. He was enslaved, hunted, defeated in battle, betrayed by allies, forced to flee with a handful of followers. Each time he rebuilt and came back stronger. This psychological resilience, this refusal to accept defeat, was perhaps his greatest personal quality. But we must also acknowledge the costs. The Mongol conquests were catastrophically violent. The death toll is uncertain. Medieval chroniclers exaggerated, and demographic data is unreliable, but certainly numbered in the millions. Cities that had flourished for centuries were reduced to rubble. Cultural treasures were destroyed. Entire populations were displaced or annihilated. Can we judge Genghis Khan by modern moral standards? Historians debate this question. Some argue that judging historical figures by contemporary values is anachronistic and unfair. Others contend that certain actions mass murder, the deliberate destruction of civilian populations are wrong in any era. Perhaps the most honest assessment is this: Genghis Khan was a product of his time and place, a brutal age when violence was the normal means of resolving disputes and acquiring resources. By the standards of his own era, his actions were not uniquely cruel, but he operated on a scale that made him uniquely consequential. The magnitude of both his achievements and his atrocities sets him apart. What should his ultimate legacy be? This is not a question with a single answer. For the descendants of those slaughtered in the Mongol invasions, he remains a symbol of destruction and trauma. For Mongolians, he is a national hero and founding father. For historians, he is a fascinating figure whose life illuminates the forces that shape history. For students of military strategy, he is a model of effective leadership and innovation. For ethicists, he is a troubling example of how great achievements can be built on immense suffering. Perhaps the most important lesson of Genghis Khan's life is about the nature of power and leadership. He demonstrated that effective organization, strategic thinking, and adaptability can overcome enormous disadvantages. He showed that a small group of disciplined, motivated people can change the world. He proved that leadership is not about birth or privilege, but about ability and determination. He also demonstrated the tremendous cost of ambition realized through violence. The empire he built connected the world, but the process of building it traumatized entire civilizations. His story reminds us that great historical changes rarely come without suffering, and that the individuals we celebrate as world changers often leave complex, troubling legacies. In the end, Genghis Khan was neither a simple hero nor a simple villain. He was a human being of extraordinary capability, who lived in an extraordinary time and shaped history on a scale few have ever matched. He was brutal and brilliant, terrifying and innovative, destructive and constructive. He contained multitudes. Today, as we look back across 8 centuries, we can see the world Genghis Khan helped create. The ethnic composition of Central Asia reflects centuries of Mongol rule and migrations. The trade routes he secured laid foundations for global commerce. The principle of religious tolerance he practiced, however, imperfectly prefigured modern pluralism. The administrative techniques he pioneered influenced empires for centuries. But we also see the scars. The trauma of the Mongol invasions entered cultural memory across Eurasia, shaping how different peoples viewed outsiders and threats. The destruction of cities and populations altered demographic patterns permanently. The genetic legacy of the conquests, if the scientists are correct, flows in the blood of millions. Genghis Khan's story is ultimately a story about human potential in all its complexity. It shows what a single individual starting from nothing can achieve through intelligence, determination, and ruthless focus. It also shows the tremendous cost that such achievements can exact. It reminds us that history is made by human choices, that those choices have consequences, and that those consequences echo through centuries. The boy born on the steppes with a blood clot in his fist became a man who changed the world. Whether that change was ultimately for better or worse remains debated. What is certain is that Genghis Khan's life matters, that his story illuminates fundamental truths about leadership, power, and human nature, and that his legacy, complex, troubling, and profound, will continue to fascinate and challenge us for generations to come. On a remote hillside in Mongolia, somewhere near where he was born, Genghis Khan rests in an unmarked grave, its location lost to time. Perhaps it is fitting that the man who conquered half the world lies in a place no one can find. His final resting place, as mysterious as some aspects of his character remain. But his impact on history is indelible. The world we live in today was shaped in ways large and small by the life of Temüjin of the Borjigin clan, the man who became Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the conqueror of the world. As the evening settles over the Mongolian steppe, as the sun sinks toward the western horizon and the shadows lengthen across the grasslands, we can imagine the wind moving through the forests of Burkhan Khaldun, rustling the pine needles, whispering through the rocks. Somewhere in those depths, The man who was once Temüjin rests undisturbed, his sleep as eternal as the blue sky he worshipped. The world he knew is long gone. The felt tents have given way to cities. The horse-riding warriors have been replaced by different kinds of armies. The Silk Road caravans have been superseded by highways and air routes. But the impact of his life remains, woven into the fabric of human history, shaping the world we inhabit today in ways both visible and hidden. And so we leave him there on his mountain beneath the eternal blue sky, the wind moving through the ancient forests, the grasslands stretching endlessly away in all directions. The story complete, the silence profound, the mystery preserved, the legend enduring forever.